Imagine waking up one day knowing that an entire city had been abandoned almost overnight, its streets left silent and untouched by time, where every stone seems to hold a story that no one can fully explain. What happened here? And could the ruins still be hiding secrets that history has never uncovered? From afar, it appears almost impossible. A cluster of ancient stone buildings clings to the top of a steep hill, rising dramatically above the rugged landscape of southern Italy. The town seems to emerge directly from the rock itself, blending so completely with the surrounding cliffs that it is difficult to tell where nature ends and human construction begins. Today, no permanent residents live here. The streets are silent. The houses are empty. Wind moves through broken windows and abandoned courtyards where daily life once unfolded. Yet, despite decades of abandonment, the town remains astonishingly intact, preserving the eerie impression that time simply stopped. Craco's origins stretch deep into the medieval past. Historical records suggest that settlements existed in this region more than 1,000 years ago, though the surrounding area had been inhabited long before then. Positioned high above the valleys below, the town occupied a naturally defensive location. In an era of raids, invasions, and constant uncertainty, elevation meant survival. The hill offered protection. From its heights, inhabitants could observe approaching travelers long before they arrived. The surrounding terrain acted as a natural fortress, making attacks difficult and costly. Over generations, families built homes, churches, storage buildings, and defensive structures. The settlement expanded upward, adapting to the contours of the steep hillside. Life was never easy. The landscape surrounding Craco is beautiful, but it can also be unforgiving. Dry summers, unstable soil, and rugged terrain challenge those who called the town home. Yet people remained for centuries. They farmed the land, they raised children, they buried their dead. Entire generations lived and died within sight of the same stone tower that still dominates the skyline today. Then something began to change. The very hill that had protected the town for centuries also concealed a growing threat. The geology beneath Craco was unstable. Layers of clay and sediment shifted slowly beneath the weight of the settlement. Erosion gradually weakened the slopes. Small landslides became increasingly common. At first, the danger may have seemed manageable. People adapted, as they always had. Damaged structures were repaired. Cracks were patched. Life continued. But nature was patient. Throughout the 20th century, a series of geological events intensified the instability. Landslides damaged parts of the town. Infrastructure deteriorated. The risks became impossible to ignore. Eventually, authorities began relocating residents to safer locations nearby. Families packed their belongings. Doors were locked. Homes were abandoned. One by one, the residents left behind the place where their ancestors had lived for centuries. Yet the departure created a strange paradox. Most abandoned settlements slowly disappear. Buildings collapse. Materials are scavenged. Nature reclaims the landscape. But Craco remained. Because so few people returned to alter or redevelop it, the town became a remarkably preserved snapshot of another era. Walking through its streets today feels unsettling. You can still see stairways leading nowhere. Empty rooms remain open to the sky. Churches stand silent, their interiors stripped of worshippers, but still retaining traces of their former grandeur. The architecture reflects centuries of adaptation, with structures layered upon one another like pages in an enormous stone manuscript. Every corner hints at forgotten stories. A doorway, a balcony, a narrow passage disappearing into shadow. Who stood there? What conversations filled these streets? What fears and hopes occupied the minds of those who watched sunsets from these same hills hundreds of years ago? The silence offers no answers. Perhaps that silence explains why Craco exerts such a powerful hold on the imagination. Unlike many archaeological sites, it does not belong to the distant ancient world. It feels familiar, human, recognizable. The buildings are not reduced to foundations or scattered fragments. They still resemble a living town, and that makes the emptiness more haunting. You are not looking at ruins alone. You are looking at absence. Film directors quickly recognized this atmosphere. Over the years, the abandoned town has appeared in numerous films and documentaries. Its dramatic skyline and ghostly streets create an almost dreamlike setting. Cameras capture what visitors immediately sense. Craco feels suspended between worlds, not entirely alive, not entirely gone. Yet beneath its cinematic reputation lies a deeper mystery. Archaeologists and historians can explain many aspects of the town's history. They can identify dates, reconstruct events, and trace the causes of its abandonment. But facts alone do not fully account for the emotional power of the place. Why do abandoned locations affect us so deeply? Perhaps because they confront us with the fragility of permanence. Generations invested their lives here. They built homes intended to endure. They established communities that seemed inseparable from the landscape itself. For centuries, the town survived wars, political upheavals, economic changes, and shifting empires. Then, within a relatively short period, it fell silent. The streets that once echoed with footsteps now belong to the wind. The houses remain, but the people are gone. And the hill continues to watch over the valleys below, exactly as it has for centuries. As twilight settles across the stone buildings, shadows stretch through empty windows and deserted alleys. The ancient tower still stands above the town, surveying a landscape that has changed countless times. It witnessed prosperity. It witnessed decline. It witnessed departure. And perhaps it still guards secrets. Because even now, standing among the abandoned streets, one question lingers. Is Craco merely a deserted town preserved by circumstance? Or does its enduring presence reveal something deeper about the civilizations we build, the places we leave behind, and the traces of ourselves that remain long after we are gone? Far from the crowded cities of the modern Middle East, an ancient settlement rests among the rugged landscapes of present-day Jordan. At first glance, it appears quiet, ordinary even. But beneath the weathered stones lies evidence of a place that once connected cultures, religions, and trade routes, stretching across vast distances. The mystery begins with its location. Khirbet edh-Dharih stands along territory once influenced by the Nabateans, the remarkable civilization best known for creating the legendary city of Petra. Yet, unlike Petra, with its monumental facades carved into cliffs, this site remained largely hidden from the wider world for centuries. Its secrets stayed buried beneath the earth. Wind swept across the hills. Seasons passed. Empires rose and vanished. Meanwhile, the ruins waited. When archaeologists began systematic investigations, they discovered something unexpected. This was not merely a small rural settlement. It had once been a significant religious and commercial center, occupying a strategic position within a network of routes that connected Arabia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean world. Travelers likely passed through these lands for generations. Merchants carried spices, incense, textiles, and precious goods across deserts and mountains. Pilgrims journeyed toward sacred destinations. Soldiers marched through territories controlled by competing powers. And somewhere amid this movement stood Khirbet edh-Dharih. Its history appears deeply intertwined with the Nabateans, whose influence spread across the region during the centuries before Roman domination. The Nabateans were skilled traders, engineers, and builders. They transformed harsh environments into thriving centers of commerce, mastering water management systems that allowed settlements to flourish where survival seemed unlikely. Evidence of their presence emerged throughout the site. Temples, courtyards, decorated architectural elements, sophisticated construction techniques. Together, these discoveries revealed a community that was far more complex than anyone had initially suspected. One structure attracted particular attention. A temple stood at the heart of the settlement, serving as a focal point for religious activity. Although time damaged much of the building, surviving remains suggest that it once possessed an impressive appearance. Stone carvings, architectural decorations, and carefully planned layouts point toward rituals that played an important role in local life. Yet many details remain elusive. Ancient religions often leave behind fragments rather than explanations. Archaeologists can identify altars, ceremonial spaces, and sacred architecture. They can trace influences from neighboring cultures. But understanding exactly what people believed is far more difficult. The stones preserve actions, not thoughts. Who gathered here? Which gods were honored within these walls? What prayers rose into the desert air? The answers remain frustratingly incomplete. As excavations continued, researchers uncovered signs that the settlement evolved across multiple historical periods. Nabatean influence gradually blended with Roman traditions after the Roman Empire absorbed the Nabatean kingdom in the 2nd century AD. The transition did not happen overnight. Cultures merged, customs adapted, architectural styles changed. Instead of disappearing entirely, older traditions often survived alongside newer influences. This blending created a fascinating cultural landscape in which identities overlapped rather than replaced one another. You can almost imagine the scene: merchants arriving from distant regions, local residents conducting daily business, religious ceremonies unfolding within sacred spaces, conversations occurring in different languages, beliefs and traditions interacting across generations. For a time, the settlement appears to have prospered. Yet prosperity rarely lasts forever. Like countless ancient communities, Khirbet edh-Dharih eventually entered a period of decline. Trade routes shifted, political realities changed, economic networks evolved. The factors responsible remain complex, and no single explanation fully accounts for the site's gradual abandonment. The process was likely slow. Years became decades. Buildings deteriorated. Populations decreased. Activities that once filled the settlement with life became increasingly rare. Eventually, silence replaced movement. Nature began reclaiming the landscape. Walls collapsed, roofs vanished. Sand and soil accumulated over abandoned structures. The settlement faded from memory. And that is where another mystery emerges. Many ancient sites survive because later civilizations built directly upon them. New settlements replace old ones. Layers accumulate over centuries. But Khirbet edh-Dharih experienced a different fate. Large portions remained relatively undisturbed, allowing archaeological evidence to survive beneath the surface. This preservation created an extraordinary opportunity. Every excavation uncovered pieces of a forgotten story. Pottery fragments revealed patterns of trade. Architectural remains exposed changing cultural influences. Religious structures offered glimpses into ancient spiritual life. Yet each discovery generated new questions. The more archaeologists learned, the more complicated the picture became. Was the settlement primarily a religious center, a commercial hub, a regional administrative site? Perhaps all three. No single interpretation seems entirely sufficient. Even the temple itself raises uncertainties. Scholars continue debating aspects of its purpose, symbolism, and significance within broader Nabatean religious traditions. Similar questions surround the identities of the people who worshipped there and the precise nature of the ceremonies they performed. The evidence whispers. It does not explain. Today, visitors encounter a landscape of weathered stones beneath open skies. The dramatic monuments of Petra attract far greater attention, drawing millions eager to witness one of archaeology's most famous wonders. Meanwhile, Khirbet edh-Dharih remains comparatively quiet, almost hidden, and perhaps that makes it even more intriguing. Without towering facades or colossal structures dominating the horizon, the site invites a different kind of reflection. Here, the mystery emerges not from overwhelming grandeur, but from subtle traces left behind by ordinary lives intertwined with extraordinary historical forces. As evening shadows lengthen across the ruins, the outlines of ancient walls begin to blur into the surrounding terrain. The temple remains silent. The roads lead nowhere. The people who once gathered here vanished long ago, yet fragments of their world endure, waiting. And among those weathered stones, one question continues to linger. Did Khirbet edh-Dharih simply serve as another settlement along ancient trade routes, or was it part of a much larger story whose most important chapters have been lost forever beneath the sands of time? Across the vast steppes of southeastern Kazakhstan, the landscape appears almost endless. Grasslands stretch toward distant horizons. Rocky hills rise from the earth in scattered formations. The wind moves freely across terrain that has changed little over thousands of years. At first, there seems to be nothing unusual here. Then the stones begin to speak. Carved into dark rock faces are thousands of ancient images, animals, hunters, warriors, rituals, and symbols left behind by people whose names have long vanished from history. Together, these carvings form one of the most remarkable collections of rock art in Central Asia. Yet among all these images, a particular group stands apart. Strange figures with radiant heads, human forms crowned with circles from which rays extend outward like beams of sunlight. Mysterious, unsettling, unforgettable. Today, they are often called the sunhead petroglyphs of Tamgaly, and despite decades of study, their true meaning remains elusive. The Tamgaly landscape contains more than 5,000 known petroglyphs, distributed across numerous rock surfaces. Archaeologists believe the site was used repeatedly over many centuries, with different cultures adding their own images to the growing collection. This was not a single moment in history frozen in stone. It was a place revisited again and again, generation after generation. Some carvings date back to the Bronze Age, more than 3,000 years ago. Others were created much later. Together, they form a visual record spanning immense stretches of time. Yet the most famous images belong to the oldest layers, the sun-headed figures. Unlike ordinary depictions of humans, these beings appear almost supernatural. Their bodies resemble people, but their heads are transformed into radiant discs surrounded by projecting lines. Some stand alone. Others appear in larger scenes involving groups of individuals, animals, or ceremonial activities. The effect is striking. Even modern viewers immediately recognize that these figures were intended to be special. The question is why? One possibility is that they represent deities. Ancient cultures across Eurasia often associated the sun with divine power, authority, fertility, and cosmic order. The radiant heads may symbolize gods connected to celestial forces that governed life and survival on the steppe. It is an appealing explanation, but certainty remains out of reach. Other researchers suggest the figures depict priests or spiritual leaders rather than gods themselves. Elaborate headdresses, ceremonial costumes, or ritual masks may have transformed ordinary humans into sacred participants during religious ceremonies. If so, the carvings may capture moments of ritual rather than portray supernatural beings. Yet another interpretation proposes something even more complex. Perhaps the radiant circles do not represent physical objects at all. Instead, they could symbolize spiritual power, altered states of consciousness, or concepts impossible to fully reconstruct after thousands of years. The challenge is obvious. The artists left images, not explanations. No written records accompany the carvings. No inscriptions identify the figures. The people who created them vanished long before history could record their beliefs. The stones preserved their symbols, not their meanings. As archaeologists examined the broader site, additional mysteries emerged. Many of the sun-headed figures appear within larger compositions involving movement, dance, sacrifice, or communal gatherings. Some scenes suggest organized ceremonies. Others seem to depict interactions between humans and animals. Several carvings show groups arranged in patterns that appear intentional and symbolic. You can almost imagine standing here thousands of years ago. The rocky valley illuminated by firelight. Drums echoing against stone. Participants gathering beneath the stars. Ceremonies unfolding whose significance has been forgotten. Was Tamgaly merely a place where people lived? Or was it something more? A sacred landscape? A ceremonial center? A destination for rituals repeated across generations? Many scholars lean toward the latter possibility. The concentration of symbolic imagery suggests that this location held unusual importance. Certain rock formations appear positioned in ways that naturally create gathering spaces. The surrounding environment itself may have contributed to the site's sacred character. Ancient people often viewed distinctive landscapes differently than we do today. A valley was not merely a valley. A mountain was not merely a mountain. Natural features could serve as gateways between worlds, locations where the human and divine intersected. Perhaps Tamgaly was one such place. If so, the sun-headed figures may represent only part of a much larger spiritual system, now lost to time. And that possibility opens even deeper questions. What beliefs inspired these images? What stories accompanied them? What myths explained their existence? The petroglyphs remain silent, yet they continue attracting interpretations far beyond archaeology. Over the years, some observers have proposed increasingly speculative explanations. The unusual appearance of the radiant figures has inspired theories involving forgotten civilizations, advanced ancient knowledge, and even visitors from beyond Earth. Most archaeologists reject such claims. The evidence strongly supports human creation within known cultural contexts, and yet the persistence of these theories reveals something important. The images possess a strange power. Even now, they feel unfamiliar. The figures do not resemble ordinary portraits. Their appearance seems deliberately designed to evoke awe, mystery, and significance. Whoever carved them wanted viewers to understand that these beings occupied a different realm from everyday life. Thousands of years later, that message still works, perhaps too well. As centuries passed, cultures changed across Central Asia. New peoples entered the region, languages evolved, belief systems transformed, empires rose and disappeared across the steppe, yet the carvings endured, exposed to sun, exposed to wind, exposed to time itself. Some survived remarkably intact, others gradually faded, but enough remained to preserve fragments of a worldview that would otherwise have vanished completely. Today, visitors walk among the same rocks that ancient artists once used as their canvas. The valley remains quiet. The surrounding hills remain unchanged. In certain moments, it becomes easier to understand why generations returned here. The place feels different, ancient, watchful. As sunlight moves across the stone surfaces, the famous figures emerge from the rock. Their radiant heads seem almost alive in shifting shadows. They stand where they have stood for millennia, guarding meanings that remain frustratingly beyond reach. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. Not who carved them, not when they were created, but whether the people who made these images intended future generations to understand them at all. Because as the sun sets over Tamgaly and darkness begins to reclaim the valley, the radiant figures remain fixed in stone, staring outward across thousands of years, still waiting, still watching, and still asking a question that no one has yet been able to answer. Were these extraordinary carvings meant to depict gods, priests, spirits, or something entirely different, something whose meaning disappeared long ago with the civilization that created them? Deep within the deserts of Egypt, beyond the fertile ribbon of the Nile, an unusual landscape emerges from the sand. It is a place of stone. Massive blocks lie scattered across the ground. Partially cut columns remain attached to the bedrock. Ancient tool marks stretch across exposed surfaces, preserved beneath centuries of dust and sunlight. At first glance, it appears abandoned, and it is. But this silence hides a remarkable story. Near the ruins of the monastery of St. Simeon, archaeologists discovered evidence of a quarry unlike many others in Egypt. Here, workers once extracted enormous quantities of stone, destined for construction projects across the region. The site preserves not only the material remains of ancient industry, but also a rare glimpse into the immense effort required to build civilizations from the desert itself. The quarry feels frozen in the middle of a task never completed. Half-finished blocks remain where workers left them. Cuts in the stone abruptly stop. Projects appear interrupted, as if something caused activity to cease before the work was done. That impression immediately raises questions. Why was this quarry established here? Who labored within it? And what caused the work to end? The surrounding monastery provides part of the answer. The monastery of St. Simeon, located near Aswan, was one of the most significant Christian monastic centers in medieval Egypt. Founded centuries after the age of the pharaohs, it stood as a spiritual outpost on the edge of the desert, housing monks who devoted their lives to prayer, study, and religious discipline. Yet monasteries required resources. Buildings needed stone. Walls needed repair. New structures demanded construction materials. The nearby quarry offered an obvious solution. At some point, workers began extracting sandstone from the surrounding landscape, transforming the desert into a source of architectural wealth. The process was anything but simple. Ancient quarrying demanded extraordinary skill and patience. Before a single block could be moved, workers had to identify suitable sections of rock. Channels were then cut around the desired stone. Wooden wedges, metal tools, and carefully planned techniques gradually separated massive blocks from the bedrock. The labor was relentless. Dust filled the air. The desert heat was unforgiving. Every stage required coordination and experience. Even after extraction, the challenge had only begun. The stone still needed transportation, and that may have been the most difficult task of all. Some blocks weighed several tons. Moving them across uneven terrain demanded manpower, animals, and sophisticated logistical planning. Roads had to be navigated. Obstacles had to be overcome. Every successful delivery represented a triumph of organization over environment. Standing among the quarry remains today, you can almost hear the echoes, the sound of chisels striking stone, commands shouted across the worksite, the scraping of sledges dragging heavy loads across the desert ground. For centuries, such sounds would have broken the silence. Now only the wind remains. Yet the quarry contains mysteries extending beyond its practical function. One of the most intriguing aspects is its unfinished appearance. Archaeologists have identified numerous examples of partially completed work. Blocks remain attached to parent rock. Extraction channels end abruptly. Certain areas look as though workers intended to return but never did. Why? Several explanations are possible. Economic changes may have reduced demand. Political instability could have disrupted operations. Labor shortages may have made continued quarrying impractical. The monastery itself eventually declined, potentially eliminating the primary reason for maintaining the site. Each possibility has merit. None provides complete certainty. History often preserves outcomes more clearly than causes. The quarry's relationship with the monastery adds another layer of fascination. At first glance, spiritual devotion and industrial stone extraction seem unrelated. One concerns faith, the other concerns labor. Yet, in reality, they were deeply connected. Religious communities required physical infrastructure. Churches, cells, defensive walls, storage facilities, and gathering spaces all depended upon stone. Spiritual life could not exist independently of the practical realities that sustained it. The quarry became part of that system, an invisible foundation beneath visible faith. But there is something else that makes the site remarkable. It reveals how thoroughly human beings transformed even the harshest environments. The surrounding desert appears hostile to permanent activity. Water is scarce. Temperatures are extreme. Resources seem limited. And yet people built monasteries here. They established communities. They quarried stone. They created networks of survival and purpose in landscapes that many would consider uninhabitable. The achievement feels almost improbable. Perhaps that is why the quarry retains such power. It is not a monument in the traditional sense. There are no towering statues, no elaborate temples, no famous royal tombs. Instead, it preserves the hidden labor behind history, the work that made larger achievements possible. Without quarries, monuments could not exist. Without stone extraction, cities could not rise. Without countless unnamed workers, many of the structures we admire today would never have been built. Yet those workers rarely appear in historical records. Their names disappeared. Their stories vanished. Only the marks they left in stone remain, and those marks continue to raise questions. Who spent their lives here beneath the desert sun? What did they think as they shaped the rock? Did they view their labor as ordinary work, religious service, or something in between? The quarry offers clues, not answers. As centuries passed, the monastery declined. Regional circumstances changed. Trade patterns shifted. Populations moved elsewhere. Eventually, both monastery and quarry entered a long period of abandonment. The desert reclaimed the landscape. Sand accumulated. Structures deteriorated. Silence returned. But unlike many ancient sites, the arid environment preserved remarkable details. Tool marks remain visible. Extraction techniques can still be studied. The unfinished nature of the quarry provides an unusually direct connection to the people who once worked there. It is almost as if they stepped away only moments ago. Almost. As evening approaches, long shadows stretch across the quarry floor. The abandoned blocks glow beneath the fading sunlight. Half-finished cuts become more pronounced. The entire landscape takes on an atmosphere of suspension, caught between completion and abandonment. A project interrupted. A story unfinished. And perhaps that unfinished quality is what makes the site so compelling. Because somewhere within these silent stones lies a moment that history never fully recorded. The moment when the work stopped. The moment when the tools fell quiet. The moment when the workers left. And standing among the quarry remains today, one question still lingers across the desert air. What happened here that caused an active center of labor and construction to fade into silence, leaving behind a landscape that appears forever frozen between intention and completion? A lonely hill rises above the Scottish countryside. For thousands of years, people climbed its slopes. They gathered on its summit. They buried their dead there. They returned again and again, long after the original purpose of the place may have been forgotten. Something about this hill mattered. Something powerful enough to survive centuries of change. Today, Cairnpapple Hill appears deceptively simple. Grass covers most of the monument. The surrounding landscape is peaceful, dotted with farms and distant settlements. Visitors arriving for the first time often see little more than a gentle rise overlooking the countryside. But appearances are misleading. Beneath the surface lies one of the most complex prehistoric ceremonial sites in Britain, a place whose history stretches back more than 5,000 years. Few locations preserve such a long record of human activity. Fewer still reveal so clearly how generations repeatedly transformed a landscape while continuing to treat it as sacred. The story begins during the Neolithic period. This was an age before metal tools became common, before written records existed, and before the great kingdoms of later history emerged. Communities across Britain were beginning to reshape their world. Agriculture spread across the landscape. Permanent settlements became more established. Monumental construction projects appeared in places that seemed to have carried special significance. Cairnpapple Hill became one of those places. Archaeological excavations revealed evidence of an early ceremonial enclosure on the summit. Large pits and post holes suggest that substantial wooden structures once stood there. Although the timber itself vanished long ago, the traces left in the soil reveal a carefully organized space. These were not ordinary buildings. They occupied a prominent hilltop visible from great distances. Their location suggests that the summit served as a gathering place, perhaps for ceremonies, seasonal events, or rituals connected to beliefs now lost forever. Why this hill was chosen remains uncertain. Perhaps its elevated position gave it symbolic importance. Perhaps communities viewed it as a place closer to the sky or to spiritual forces. Perhaps local traditions associated the summit with stories passed down through generations. The evidence cannot provide a definitive answer. It can only show that people invested enormous effort here. And that effort continued for centuries. One of the most remarkable aspects of Cairnpapple is that it was never simply abandoned and forgotten. Instead, successive generations reused the site, modifying older features and adding new ones. The hill became a living monument, constantly changing while retaining its importance. As time passed, its role evolved. During the Bronze Age, burial activity became increasingly prominent. Archaeologists discovered graves and burial monuments incorporated into the earlier ceremonial landscape. Individuals were interred within stone-lined graves known as cists. Burial mounds appeared on the summit. The dead were placed among monuments that were already ancient. This raises a fascinating possibility. By the time some of these burials took place, the earliest structures on the hill may already have been thousands of years old. The people conducting the funerals may not have fully understood who built the original monuments or why they existed. Yet they still chose to bury their dead there. Why? Many archaeologists believe that ancient communities often recognized the importance of old places even when their original meanings had faded. A location associated with ancestors, mystery, or tradition could retain spiritual authority simply because it had always been significant. The age of the place became part of its power. Imagine standing on the summit 3,000 years ago. Around you rise ancient earthworks built by people whose names have been forgotten. Stories about the hill circulate through your community, but no one knows the complete truth. The monuments seem to belong to another age, and yet they remain sacred. You participate in ceremonies there. You bury your dead there. You continue traditions inherited from countless generations before you. In that sense, the hill may have been mysterious even to the people who used it, a mystery preserved within another mystery. This pattern appears elsewhere across prehistoric Britain. Ancient monuments were frequently reused by later cultures. Sacred sites accumulated layers of meaning over time. Their significance evolved, but it rarely disappeared completely. Cairnpapple Hill provides one of the clearest examples of this process. Every generation left its mark. Every generation altered the landscape. Yet none erased what came before. The result is an archaeological record unlike almost any other. When major excavations took place during the 20th century, researchers uncovered evidence from multiple periods stacked upon one another. Ceremonial features intersected with later burials. New constructions incorporated older structures. The summit revealed a sequence of activity extending across millennia. Each discovery added another layer to the story, and another layer to the mystery. The more archaeologists learned about the site, the more difficult it became to explain its exact purpose. Certain features suggest ceremonial gatherings. Others indicate funerary activity. Some may have served symbolic functions impossible to identify today. No single interpretation fully accounts for everything. Was Cairnpapple primarily a ritual center, a burial landscape, a gathering place for scattered communities, a monument connected to ancestor worship? Perhaps it was all of these things at different times. Or perhaps its true significance belonged to a belief system that has vanished completely. That possibility highlights one of archaeology's greatest challenges. Physical remains survive. Ideas do not. Researchers can uncover graves, monuments, and artifacts. They can establish dates and reconstruct sequences of construction. But the thoughts of the people themselves are largely inaccessible. What emotions did they feel while standing on the hill? What stories did they tell about its origins? What ceremonies unfolded beneath the open sky? Those answers may never be recovered. The monuments remain. The meanings are gone. Today, visitors can still stand where ancient communities once gathered. The view remains impressive. Fields stretch toward the horizon. Hills rise in the distance. Wind moves across the summit much as it did thousands of years ago. The landscape feels timeless, and perhaps that timelessness explains part of the site's appeal. Human lives are brief. Civilizations rise and fall. Languages emerge and disappear. Yet certain places continue attracting attention across vast stretches of history. Cairnpapple Hill is one of those places. For more than 5,000 years, people returned here seeking something: connection, memory, ceremony, meaning. Whatever they found, they considered it important enough to preserve. Yet the reason remains elusive. As evening shadows lengthen across the summit, the ancient monument grows quiet once more. The burials remain hidden beneath the earth. The earliest structures survive only as traces. The people who understood the hill's significance vanished long ago. And despite decades of study, one question still lingers over the windswept landscape. Why did generation after generation continue returning to this lonely hill for thousands of years, even after the origins of its sacred power may have been forgotten? At the southwestern edge of one of the most isolated inhabited islands on Earth, a ceremonial village stands on the rim of a volcanic crater. Beyond it, the Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly toward the horizon. Waves crash against black cliffs hundreds of feet below. Offshore, small rocky islets rise from the sea like fragments of another world. Wind sweeps across the landscape almost constantly, carrying the sound of the ocean into every corner of the site. It is a dramatic setting, a place that feels deliberately chosen, and for centuries, it served as the center of one of the most unusual rituals ever documented in the ancient world. This is Orongo, located on the island known today as Rapa Nui. While the island is famous for its colossal stone statues, the mysteries of Orongo reveal a very different chapter of its history. One that emerged after the era of the Great Moai was already beginning to fade. The village occupies the rim of the volcano, known as Rano Kau. From here, the inhabitants could look in one direction towards the vast ocean, and in the other towards the crater's interior, where a freshwater lake rests among dense vegetation. The location seems almost symbolic. Land, sea, sky, all meeting at a single point. Archaeologists believe Orongo became particularly important during a period of profound change on the island. For centuries, the people of Rapa Nui had constructed and transported the famous moai, enormous stone figures that continue to fascinate researchers and visitors alike. Then something shifted. The reasons remain debated. Environmental pressures, social transformations, resource shortages, internal conflicts, or a combination of multiple factors may have altered the structure of island society. Whatever happened, the focus of religious and political life appears to have evolved. And at the center of that evolution stood Orongo. The village itself consists of dozens of stone houses built with remarkable skill. Unlike conventional homes, these structures were low and narrow. Their entrances were extremely small. Thick stone walls helped them withstand powerful winds blowing across the exposed cliff top. Even today, they look unusual, almost temporary. Yet they were carefully designed. Many were partially embedded into the ground, creating a profile that blended with the surrounding landscape. From a distance, they can appear less like buildings and more like extensions of the earth itself. But the structures are only part of the story. What truly makes Orongo extraordinary is its connection to the Birdman cult, one of the most enigmatic traditions in Polynesian history. According to historical accounts and oral traditions, an annual competition played a crucial role in determining religious and political authority on the island. Representatives of different clans gathered at Orongo to participate in a dangerous contest linked to the arrival of migratory seabirds. The objective sounds deceptively simple. Retrieve the first egg of the season from a small offshore islet. The reality was far more perilous. Participants descended steep cliffs below Orongo, entered the open ocean, and swam through waters known for strong currents and sharks. After reaching the offshore islets, they waited for the arrival of sooty terns, seabirds whose nesting cycle formed the basis of the ritual. Once an egg was obtained, the competitor had to transport it safely back across the water and up the cliffs without breaking it. Success brought immense prestige. The winning individual's sponsor became the Tangata Manu, often translated as the Birdman. This title carried religious significance and elevated status within island society. The ritual combined endurance, risk, symbolism, and competition in a way rarely seen elsewhere, and yet many aspects remain unclear. Historical descriptions come primarily from later sources recorded after European contact. Oral traditions provide valuable insights, but can be difficult to interpret with complete certainty. Archaeological evidence confirms Orongo's importance, but reconstructing the precise details of ceremonies remains challenging. The result is a fascinating mixture of evidence and mystery. One of the most striking features of the site is its rock art. Hundreds of petroglyphs decorate the area surrounding the village. Many depict the Birdman figure itself, often shown with a human body and the head or beak of a bird. Other carvings represent ceremonial paddles, faces, animals, and symbols whose meanings are still debated. These images transform the landscape into a vast ceremonial canvas. Everywhere you look, traces of belief emerge from the stone. Yet, interpretation remains difficult. Were the Birdman figures representations of actual title holders, mythological beings, spiritual transformations, symbols of power? Different scholars have proposed different answers. None can claim complete certainty. The more researchers study Orongo, the more apparent it becomes that the site operated within a sophisticated religious framework that is only partially understood today. You can imagine arriving here centuries ago. The village crowded with participants, ceremonies unfolding near the cliff edge, priests conducting rituals, competitors preparing for the dangerous challenge ahead. Below, waves smash against volcanic rock. Beyond them lie the small islets where victory and prestige await. The atmosphere must have been extraordinary. Part religious pilgrimage, part political event, part test of courage, and all of it unfolding in one of the most isolated locations on Earth. Isolation itself forms another layer of the mystery. Rapa Nui lies thousands of kilometers from major continental landmasses. Reaching the island required remarkable navigational skill. The people who settled it crossed vast stretches of ocean using traditional Polynesian voyaging techniques, accomplishing journeys that many once considered impossible. Their achievement remains astonishing. Yet by the time Orongo flourished, the island's inhabitants had developed a unique cultural identity, shaped by centuries of relative isolation. The Birdman tradition appears to have been distinctly local. It reflected the island's environment, its social structure, and its evolving religious worldview. In many ways, Orongo represents adaptation. As circumstances changed, society changed with them. Old traditions gave way to new ones. Power shifted. Beliefs evolved. The village became the stage upon which those transformations played out. Then came another change. European contact introduced diseases, disruptions, and social upheavals that profoundly affected island life. Traditional systems weakened. Population numbers declined dramatically. Ceremonial practices that had endured for generations gradually disappeared. Orongo fell silent. The competitions ended. The rituals ceased. The stone houses were abandoned. Only the carvings remained to tell fragments of the story. Today, visitors standing on the crater rim encounter one of the most breathtaking landscapes in the Pacific. The ocean extends endlessly beyond the cliffs. The volcanic crater dominates the interior view. The stone houses remain remarkably preserved. Yet despite decades of research, Orongo retains much of its mystery. Archaeologists understand more about the site than ever before. They can reconstruct aspects of its architecture, chronology, and ceremonial importance. But understanding is not the same as knowing. The deepest meanings often remain just beyond reach. As the sun begins to descend toward the Pacific, shadows lengthen across the stone village. The petroglyphs become more pronounced in the fading light. Waves continue crashing against the cliffs exactly as they did centuries ago. The birdmen are gone. The ceremonies are gone. The voices that once filled this place have vanished. And still, one question lingers over the wind-swept rim of Orongo. Did the birdman ritual represent a practical competition wrapped in religious symbolism? Or was it part of a much deeper spiritual tradition whose true meaning disappeared when the last guardians of its secrets passed into history? Few places look more like the setting of a legend. On the northeastern coast of Scotland, a massive rocky headland rises abruptly from the sea. Towering cliffs plunge almost vertically into crashing waves below. Wind sweeps across the exposed stone. Seabirds circle overhead. From a distance, the fortress appears almost impossible to reach. And that was precisely the point. For centuries, Dunnottar Castle occupied one of the most defensible positions in Britain. Perched atop a narrow promontory connected to the mainland by a thin strip of land, it commanded both the coastline and the surrounding landscape. Yet, despite its dramatic appearance, the greatest mysteries of Dunnottar are not architectural. They are historical. Because behind the ruined walls lies a story of siege, survival, political intrigue, and hidden treasures, events so remarkable that they sometimes sound closer to myth than reality. The history of the site stretches far beyond the visible castle ruins that stand today. Long before medieval fortifications appeared, people recognized the strategic importance of this isolated rock. Archaeological evidence suggests that the headland was occupied in some form for many centuries. Early fortifications may have existed here during the Pictish period, when northern Scotland was dominated by communities whose culture remains only partially understood. The Picts left behind symbols, carvings, fragments of their world. But many aspects of their society remain elusive. And somewhere within that uncertainty lies the earliest chapter of Dunnottar's story. Historical records indicate that the site already possessed significance by the early medieval period. Its natural defenses made it an obvious location for protection and control. Any force attempting to capture the headland faced daunting challenges. The cliffs served as walls. The sea served as a moat. Nature itself became part of the fortress. Over time, successive rulers strengthened the position. Stone structures replaced earlier defenses. Towers rose above the cliffs. The isolated rock evolved into one of Scotland's most formidable strongholds. Yet the castle's story was never simply about military power. It became deeply entangled with the turbulent history of Scotland itself. Kings visited. Nobles schemed. Armies marched. Political fortunes rose and collapsed within its walls. At various points, dunnottar served as a center of regional authority, a military fortress, and a symbol of power whose importance extended far beyond its physical size. One of the most dramatic episodes occurred during the wars and conflicts that shaped 17th century Britain. The period was marked by political instability, religious disputes, and struggles for power that affected every corner of the kingdom. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, dunnottar found itself at the center of an extraordinary mission: protecting the honors of Scotland. Today, they are recognized as Scotland's crown jewels, the crown, scepter, and sword associated with the monarchy. These objects possessed immense symbolic value. To lose them would have been a devastating political and cultural blow, and they were in danger. During the campaigns of Oliver Cromwell, English forces advanced across Scotland. Strongholds fell, resistance weakened. The possibility that the crown jewels could be captured became increasingly real. Dunnottar was chosen as their refuge. The decision made sense. The fortress was exceptionally difficult to attack. Its position atop sheer cliffs offered significant defensive advantages. If any place could safeguard such treasures, it seemed to be dunnottar. But even the strongest fortress could not remain isolated forever. Soon, enemy forces arrived. A siege began. The defenders faced mounting pressure as months passed. Supplies dwindled. Escape routes narrowed. The likelihood of eventual capture increased steadily. And yet, when the fortress finally surrendered, the crown jewels were nowhere to be found. They had vanished. What happened next remains one of the most celebrated stories in Scottish history. According to historical accounts, the treasures were secretly removed from the castle during the siege. Exactly how this was accomplished remains debated. Different versions of the story emphasize different individuals and methods. Some accounts describe daring smuggling operations. Others focus on local residents who helped conceal the regalia from occupying forces. Whatever the precise details, the result was astonishing. The jewels escaped. The fortress fell. But the symbols of the nation survived. It is the kind of story that seems almost too perfect. A desperate siege, hidden treasures, secret escapes. Yet it happened. Or at least enough of it happened to ensure that the episode became permanently embedded within Scotland's historical memory. Still, mysteries remain. How exactly were the treasures moved? Who participated? How close did the operation come to failure? The surviving evidence does not answer every question. History preserves the outcome more clearly than the process. The castle itself witnessed many other dramatic events: executions, political imprisonments, military occupations, religious conflicts. Each generation added another layer to its already complex story. One particularly grim chapter involved prisoners held within the fortress under harsh conditions. Some accounts describe confinement so severe that the castle earned a dark reputation among those who knew its history. The cliffs that protected the stronghold also enhanced its isolation. Once inside, escape was difficult, perhaps impossible. You can imagine approaching dunnottar centuries ago. The sea crashes against the rocks below. The narrow approach stretches ahead. Towering walls rise above the path. Guards watch from elevated positions. Every aspect of the landscape communicates the same message. This place was meant to endure, and for a long time it did. Yet no fortress lasts forever. As military technology evolved, castles gradually lost much of their strategic value. Political circumstances changed. New forms of defense emerged. The enormous expense required to maintain such structures became increasingly difficult to justify. Dunnottar entered a period of decline. Buildings deteriorated. Roofs collapsed. Walls crumbled beneath centuries of exposure to wind and salt. The fortress slowly transformed into a ruin. But unlike many ruined castles, dunnottar never lost its dramatic presence. If anything, abandonment enhanced it. The shattered walls seem perfectly suited to the landscape. The ruins blend with the cliffs in a way that makes them appear timeless. Visitors standing on the headland today often describe a sensation that is difficult to explain. The place feels older than its history, larger than its documented past. Perhaps that impression emerges from the setting itself. Few locations combine natural grandeur and historical significance so completely. Every direction offers a reminder of isolation. Every gust of wind seems to carry echoes from another age. And despite centuries of study, some mysteries remain stubbornly unresolved. Archaeologists continue investigating earlier phases of occupation. Historians continue debating aspects of the castle's role during key events. Questions surrounding lost structures, forgotten inhabitants, and undocumented episodes persist. The evidence exists, but not all of it. Some pieces are missing. Perhaps they always will be. As evening settles over the North Sea, shadows gather among the ruined towers. The cliffs grow darker. Waves continue their endless assault against the rocks below. The fortress stands exactly where it has stood for centuries, battered but unbroken, watching, waiting, guarding its secrets. And among those secrets, one question continues to linger. How much of dunnottar's story survives only in fragments? And what forgotten events unfolded behind these walls that vanished without leaving any trace at all? At the southern tip of the Shetland Islands, where the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean collide in restless waves, one of the most extraordinary archaeological landscapes in Europe overlooks the coast. For centuries, storms battered these shores. Wind carved the cliffs. The sea consumed the land. And hidden beneath layers of earth, an entire sequence of human history waited to be revealed. Today, the site is known as Jarlshof. It is not a single settlement. It is many settlements, built one atop another across nearly 4,000 years. Bronze Age farmers, Iron Age inhabitants, Pictish communities, Norse settlers, and medieval families all occupied the same location at different times. Few places in the world preserve such an uninterrupted record of human occupation. Yet among the countless discoveries made at Jarlshof, one artifact continues to attract particular fascination: a carved stone, small in size, enormous in mystery. Known today as the Jarlshof stone, it has become one of the site's most intriguing puzzles, a relic whose meaning remains uncertain despite decades of study. The story begins long before the stone itself entered the archaeological record. Jarlshof occupies a strategic position overlooking natural approaches along the coastline. For ancient communities, the location offered advantages that were difficult to ignore. Marine resources were abundant. Travel routes passed nearby. The surrounding landscape provided opportunities for farming, fishing, and trade. Generation after generation recognized those advantages, and so they stayed. Over centuries, houses were built, abandoned, rebuilt, and replaced. New communities inherited the remains of older ones. Walls became foundations. Forgotten structures disappeared beneath later construction. The result was a layered archive of human activity, unlike almost anything else in Northern Europe. Ironically, the site remained hidden until nature intervened. During the late 19th century, powerful storms damaged parts of the coastline, exposing buried structures that had been concealed for centuries. Archaeologists soon realized that the area contained something extraordinary. Excavations followed, and with every season more of the ancient settlement emerged. Roundhouses, workshops, defensive structures, domestic objects, tools, jewelry, fragments of daily life preserved across thousands of years. The discoveries transformed Jarlshof into one of Scotland's most important archaeological sites, yet some finds proved easier to understand than others. The Jarlshof stone belongs firmly in the second category. Unlike ordinary building materials, this stone bears carved markings whose purpose remains uncertain. Researchers have proposed multiple interpretations, but no consensus has emerged. The carvings appear deliberate and meaningful, suggesting that the object held significance beyond practical use. The challenge lies in understanding what that significance was. Ancient symbols often resist modern interpretation. The people who created them rarely leave instructions. Context disappears. Meanings evolve. Entire belief systems vanish. All that remains are the symbols themselves. Silent, cryptic, open to interpretation. Some scholars believe the markings may represent artistic decoration. Others suggest symbolic or religious meanings. Still others have proposed connections to social identity, ownership, ritual practices, or forms of communication that no longer survive. Each theory explains part of the evidence. None explains everything. That uncertainty has fueled fascination for decades. The stone raises a fundamental question faced throughout archaeology. How do we interpret objects created by people whose worldview has completely disappeared? Modern observers naturally search for familiar patterns. We compare ancient symbols to known writing systems, religious imagery, or artistic traditions. Sometimes those comparisons prove useful. Sometimes they mislead. The Jarlshof stone exists precisely within that space of uncertainty. Its carvings seem intentional, yet their message remains elusive. To understand why this matters, it helps to consider the broader world of ancient Shetland. Life in these islands was never easy. The environment could be harsh and unpredictable. Storms arrived suddenly. Winters were long. Communities depended upon cooperation, skill, and adaptability to survive. Yet the islands were not isolated in the way people often imagine. Evidence from Jarlshof demonstrates extensive connections with the wider world. Trade networks linked Shetland to other regions of Britain and Scandinavia. Goods moved across considerable distances. Ideas traveled alongside them. The people who lived here were participants in larger cultural networks. They were not cut off from history. They were helping create it. This context makes the stone even more intriguing. Its carvings may reflect influences from beyond the islands. Alternatively, they may represent local traditions unique to Shetland. Determining which possibility is correct remains difficult. The evidence points in multiple directions, and that ambiguity only deepens the mystery. As archaeologists continued excavating Jarlshof, they uncovered evidence of repeated cultural transitions. New groups arrived. Existing populations adapted. Technologies changed. Languages evolved. Beliefs shifted over time. Yet the settlement endured. Few locations demonstrate continuity so clearly. Standing within the ruins today, you can walk through centuries in a matter of minutes. Bronze Age remains lie near Iron Age structures. Norse buildings stand alongside traces of earlier occupations. The entire site feels less like a single settlement and more like a condensed history of northern Britain. The Jarlshof stone emerged from this remarkable context, a single artifact surrounded by thousands of years of human activity. And perhaps that is part of the problem. There are too many possible interpretations, too many layers, too many cultural influences. A carving that appears obvious within one historical framework may mean something entirely different within another. You can imagine the frustration. Researchers study the markings carefully. Comparisons are made. New theories emerge. Evidence is evaluated. Yet certainty remains just out of reach. The stone refuses to surrender its secret. Over the years, some observers have suggested more speculative explanations. Unusual symbols often attract imaginative theories involving forgotten knowledge, lost civilizations, or mysterious traditions. Such ideas capture public attention, but most archaeologists remain cautious. The challenge is not proving the stone is extraordinary. The challenge is determining exactly how extraordinary it is. A simple explanation may exist, or it may not. The available evidence does not settle the matter, and so the mystery persists. Today, visitors exploring Jarlshof encounter one of the richest archaeological landscapes in Europe. Ancient houses overlook the sea. Layers of history unfold across the site. Every structure tells part of a larger story. Yet amid all this complexity, the carved stone continues drawing attention, perhaps because it symbolizes something fundamental about archaeology itself. The past is never fully recovered. Fragments survive. Others disappear. Researchers reconstruct what they can, but gaps remain. The Jarlshof stone occupies one of those gaps, a message from another age, a message whose language may already be lost. As evening approaches the Shetland coast, shadows stretch across the ancient settlement. Waves crash against the shoreline. Wind moves through the ruins exactly as it did centuries ago. The generations who built these homes are gone. Their voices vanished long ago. But the stone remains, patient, silent, waiting. And after all the excavations, all the research, and all the theories, one question still lingers above the ruins of Jarlshof. Did the carvings preserve a meaning that can still be recovered? Or do they belong to a world of ideas that disappeared so completely that their true purpose will never be understood again? Beneath the calm waters of a Turkish lake, an ancient church sleeps. For centuries, no one knew it was there. Fishermen crossed the surface above it. Birds drifted across the water. Seasons passed. Empires rose and vanished. The lake remained quiet, concealing a remarkable secret beneath its shallow depths. Then, in the 21st century, something unexpected appeared. Aerial photographs revealed faint outlines beneath the water, rectangular shapes, walls, the unmistakable footprint of a large building. What initially seemed like a curiosity soon became one of the most fascinating archaeological discoveries in modern Turkey. An entire basilica lay submerged beneath Lake Iznik. And with its discovery came a series of questions that researchers are still attempting to answer. The lake sits near the modern town of Iznik, known in antiquity as Nicaea. Few places possess a more significant place in Christian history. Nicaea was a major city of the Roman Empire, and later became one of the most important centers of early Christianity. It was here, in the 4th century A.D., that the famous First Council of Nicaea took place. Bishops gathered from across the Christian world. Doctrines were debated. Theological disputes were addressed. Decisions were made that would influence religious history for centuries. The city stood at the center of events that shaped an entire civilization. Yet the submerged basilica remained unknown, hidden only a short distance from shore. Its discovery occurred almost by accident. In 2014, aerial surveys intended for other purposes captured images of the lakebed. Researchers noticed geometric patterns inconsistent with natural formations. Further investigation confirmed that the shapes represented architectural remains. The outlines were remarkably clear. Walls could be traced beneath the water. The floor plan became visible. A forgotten structure had suddenly reappeared. The revelation attracted immediate attention. Archaeologists, historians, and religious scholars all recognized the significance of the find. Discovering a submerged church near one of Christianity's most important ancient cities was extraordinary enough. But the basilica's age made the discovery even more compelling. Initial studies suggested that the church had been constructed during the late Roman period, likely during the 4th century AD. This placed it within a transformative era of Christian history. Christianity had recently emerged from centuries of persecution and was becoming increasingly integrated into imperial society. Church construction expanded dramatically. Religious architecture became more ambitious. Communities invested substantial resources into creating sacred spaces. The basilica appears to have been part of that movement. Built near the shores of the lake, it would have served as a visible symbol of Christian presence within the region. Yet today, it lies underwater. Why? That question became central to the investigation. Evidence points toward a powerful earthquake as the most likely explanation. Historical records describe devastating seismic events affecting the region during antiquity. One particularly destructive earthquake struck the area in AD 740, causing extensive damage. Researchers believe the basilica may have been destroyed during this catastrophe. The building collapsed. The shoreline changed. Over time, portions of the site became submerged beneath the lake. The explanation seems plausible, perhaps even convincing. And yet, mysteries remain. Archaeology rarely provides simple answers. As divers and researchers examined the remains more closely, additional questions emerged regarding the basilica's origins and significance. The church itself appears to have been substantial. Its dimensions suggest an important structure rather than a modest local chapel. Architectural features indicate careful planning and significant investment. Someone wanted this building to make an impression. The question is who? One theory links the basilica to Saint Neophytos, an early Christian martyr reportedly executed in the region during the early 4th century. Historical sources describe his death during a period when Christians still faced persecution under Roman authorities. According to this interpretation, the church may have been constructed in his honor after Christianity gained official acceptance within the empire. The timeline fits. The location fits. But definitive proof remains elusive. No inscription has emerged confirming the dedication. No surviving document removes all doubt. The connection remains possible rather than certain. And that uncertainty continues to intrigue researchers. As underwater excavations progressed, archaeologists uncovered evidence suggesting that the site may possess an even deeper history. Beneath the basilica itself, traces of earlier occupation appear to exist. This discovery complicated the narrative considerably. Ancient, sacred sites often occupy locations that were already significant before the construction of later religious buildings. Throughout history, communities repeatedly reused places associated with spiritual meaning. A temple becomes a church. A shrine becomes a monastery. One tradition inherits a landscape shaped by another. Could that pattern be present here? Some evidence hints that the basilica may have been built atop an earlier structure, possibly connected to pre-Christian religious activity. If true, the site's history would extend far beyond the church visible today. The lake would be concealing multiple layers of human belief. multiple chapters of sacred history, all submerged beneath the same water. You can imagine standing here 1,600 years ago. The basilica rises near the shore. Worshippers gather for ceremonies. Priests conduct rituals within the sanctuary. The city of Nicaea thrives nearby, its streets filled with merchants, officials, travelers, and pilgrims. The church seems permanent, enduring, a fixture of the landscape. Then disaster strikes. The ground trembles, walls crack, buildings collapse, lives change forever. In the aftermath, the basilica begins its long descent into obscurity. Centuries pass. Water covers the ruins. Memory fades. Eventually, the church disappears completely from human awareness. Only the lake remembers. What makes the Basilica of Iznik Lake particularly fascinating is the way it challenges assumptions about archaeological discovery. Many people imagine ancient ruins hidden beneath deserts, jungles, or remote mountains. This basilica was hidden beneath a lake near a populated area. Thousands of people lived nearby. Yet the church remained unnoticed. Its presence demonstrates how much of the past can remain concealed even in places we believe we know well. The discovery also highlights the growing role of modern technology in archaeology. Without aerial imaging and advanced survey methods, the basilica might have remained hidden indefinitely. The past revealed itself only when viewed from a new perspective. And who knows how many other sites still await similar discoveries. Today, the submerged church has become a focus of continuing research. Archaeologists continue studying the remains, mapping architectural features, and investigating the deeper layers beneath the basilica. Each new discovery adds information and new questions. The structure is no longer lost, but it is not fully understood. Far from it. As sunlight filters through the waters of Lake Iznik, shadows move across the ancient walls resting below. Fish swim through spaces once occupied by worshippers. Stone foundations remain exactly where builders placed them more than 15 centuries ago. Silent, preserved, waiting. The church survived persecution, earthquakes, and centuries beneath the water. Yet its greatest mystery may still lie undiscovered. Because beneath the visible ruins of the basilica, another question continues to linger. Was this submerged church merely a casualty of natural disaster? Or does the lake conceal an even older sacred landscape, whose deepest secrets have yet to emerge from the depths? Across the islands of Malta, strange lines cut through the stone. They appear suddenly. Two parallel grooves carved deep into solid bedrock, running across hillsides, fields, and rocky landscapes. Sometimes they follow relatively straight paths. Sometimes they curve unexpectedly. In certain places they intersect, forming patterns that resemble an ancient transportation network. And then, just as mysteriously, they end. Some disappear at cliff edges. Others vanish beneath modern roads or buildings. A few continue directly into the sea. For centuries, these markings have puzzled travelers, historians, and archaeologists alike. Known as the Maltese cart ruts, they represent one of the most enduring mysteries of the Mediterranean. No one knows exactly who made them. No one knows precisely when they were created. And perhaps most surprisingly, no one knows their purpose. The islands of Malta occupy a strategic position in the center of the Mediterranean Sea. Throughout history, civilizations moving between Europe, North Africa, and the Near East passed through these waters. The islands witnessed the arrival of traders, sailors, conquerors, and settlers from numerous cultures. Yet the cart ruts seem to belong to a much older story. Their origins may stretch back thousands of years into periods that remain only partially understood. The grooves themselves are unmistakable. Most consist of two parallel channels cut into limestone bedrock. The distance between them often remains relatively consistent, suggesting a deliberate design. In some locations, the grooves are shallow. In others, they reach considerable depths, as though repeated use gradually wore them deeper into the rock. The sight is immediately striking. You stand before them and instinctively search for an explanation. Perhaps ancient carts created the tracks. Perhaps wagons repeatedly followed the same route. Perhaps generations of traffic slowly carved the grooves into the stone. It seems reasonable. Yet the mystery begins when the details are examined more closely. Many cart ruts appear in places that seem highly impractical for transportation. Some climb steep slopes. Others cross rough terrain that would challenge wheeled vehicles even today. In certain areas, multiple tracks overlap and intersect in ways that resemble a tangled network rather than an organized road system. The more closely researchers study them, the stranger they become. If they were transportation routes, why are they often so chaotic? If they were not transportation routes, why do they resemble tracks at all? These questions have fueled debate for generations. One of the most common explanations proposes that the grooves were created by carts carrying heavy loads across soft limestone surfaces. Over long periods, repeated traffic could have gradually deepened existing tracks, producing the grooves visible today. There is evidence supporting this idea. The spacing between many ruts corresponds roughly to the width of ancient wheeled vehicles. Malta's prehistoric communities transported stone and other materials. Heavy loads moving repeatedly along fixed paths could potentially create significant wear. But problems remain. Some grooves are far deeper than expected. Others traverse terrain where carts would have struggled to operate effectively. And then, there are the examples that appear to lead directly into the sea. These are perhaps the most famous. Along portions of the Maltese coastline, cart ruts extend toward the water and disappear beneath the waves. For some observers, this suggests that they originated during periods when sea levels differed from those of today. The implication is intriguing. If the tracks continue underwater because they were created before rising seas submerged portions of the coastline, their origins could be extremely ancient, possibly far older than many conventional estimates. Not all researchers agree with this interpretation. Coastlines change for many reasons. Erosion, geological activity, and local environmental conditions can alter landscapes significantly over time. Underwater extensions do not automatically require extraordinary age, yet the image remains compelling. Ancient tracks vanishing into the sea, a mystery literally disappearing beneath the surface. The cart ruts become even more fascinating when considered alongside Malta's broader prehistoric landscape. The islands are home to some of the oldest monumental structures on Earth. Massive temple complexes were constructed here, thousands of years before the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome reached their height. These prehistoric builders demonstrated impressive organizational abilities and engineering skills. Could the cart ruts be connected to those ancient societies? Many researchers think so. The timing appears plausible. The transportation of enormous stone blocks would have required sophisticated logistical systems. Networks of tracks could potentially have assisted with moving materials between quarries, settlements, and construction sites. Yet once again, certainty remains elusive. No direct evidence conclusively links the ruts to temple construction. The association is logical, but logic is not proof. Another theory proposes that the grooves were related to agricultural activities rather than transportation. Farmers may have used them to guide equipment, manage resources, or facilitate movement across the landscape. Others have suggested connections to water management systems. Still others see evidence of industrial processes now poorly understood. Each hypothesis explains certain aspects of the evidence. None explains everything, and that is precisely why the mystery endures. The cart ruts refuse to fit neatly into a single interpretation. Perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that they served multiple functions across different periods. Ancient landscapes often evolve over time. A route established for one purpose may later be adapted for another. Features created by one culture can be reused by those that follow. If this occurred in Malta, the cart ruts may not represent a single phenomenon at all. They may represent centuries of changing activity layered upon one another. Such complexity would explain many of the apparent contradictions, but proving it remains difficult. You can imagine standing on the islands thousands of years ago. Workers move across the landscape. Stone is transported from quarries. Communities expand. Paths form through repeated use. Generations inherit routes established by their ancestors. Over time, the grooves deepen. The network grows. Eventually, the original purpose becomes forgotten. The tracks remain. The explanation vanishes. This possibility highlights a recurring challenge in archaeology. Physical evidence often survives longer than cultural memory. People disappear. Languages fade. Traditions end. Yet, marks left upon the landscape can endure for millennia. The cart ruts may be precisely such marks, a visible reminder of activities whose meanings no longer survive. Today, visitors encounter these grooves throughout Malta and the neighboring island of Gozo. Some appear isolated. Others form complex systems extending across considerable distances. Modern roads, farms, and settlements often coexist alongside features that may be thousands of years old. The contrast is remarkable. Ancient mysteries embedded within modern landscapes. And, despite decades of investigation, the questions remain largely unresolved. Archaeologists continue studying the ruts using increasingly sophisticated methods. New surveys provide additional data. Comparative studies examine similar features elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Progress is made, yet the central mystery remains intact. As evening light spreads across the limestone terrain, shadows fill the ancient grooves. The parallel lines become more pronounced, stretching across the landscape like messages carved into stone by forgotten hands. They lead somewhere. They meant something. Of that much we can be reasonably certain. But what they meant and why they were created remains frustratingly beyond reach. And so the cart ruts continue their silent journey across Malta's rocky surface, disappearing over hills, through fields, and sometimes into the sea itself, leaving behind one enduring question. Were these grooves simply the practical traces of ancient transportation? Or are they the surviving fragments of a system whose true purpose has been lost so completely that modern archaeology has only begun to glimpse it? Across the rugged heart of central Anatolia, an ancient landscape unfolds among volcanic rock formations, wind-carved cliffs, and towering stone facades that seem to emerge directly from the earth itself. At first glance, it feels timeless. The terrain is vast, quiet, almost otherworldly. Yet hidden among these rocky valleys lies evidence of a civilization that once ruled much of this region, a people whose influence spread across Anatolia and whose legends survived long after their kingdom disappeared. They were the Phrygians, and the landscape they left behind remains one of the most mysterious archaeological regions in Turkey. Today, it is known simply as the Phrygian Valley. But this is not a single site. It is an enormous cultural landscape, stretching across hundreds of square kilometers, containing rock-cut monuments, ancient roads, shrines, tombs, settlements, and inscriptions carved into stone over thousands of years. Some are understood, many are not, and together they create a puzzle that archaeologists are still trying to solve. The story begins more than 3,000 years ago. Following the collapse of several Bronze Age powers in Anatolia, new groups emerged across the region. Among them were the Phrygians, a people who eventually established a powerful kingdom centered in what is now central Turkey. Ancient writers remembered them. So did legend. According to later traditions, the famous King Midas ruled the Phrygians. His name became associated with one of the most enduring myths in history, the tale of a king whose touch turned everything to gold. Whether the legendary stories reflect real events remains uncertain, but the kingdom itself certainly existed, and its people transformed the landscape around them. Unlike civilizations that expressed power primarily through massive cities, the Phrygians developed a remarkable relationship with stone. Throughout the valley, they carved monuments directly into cliffs and rock faces. Some structures resemble elaborate temple facades. Others appear to have served ceremonial or funerary purposes. Many stand isolated within the landscape, their original functions still debated. The most famous of these monuments is often called the Midas Monument. It dominates the surrounding terrain. A towering geometric facade rises from a rock face, covered in intricate patterns and framed by carefully carved architectural features. From a distance, it almost resembles the entrance to a hidden structure. Yet there is no doorway. No chamber lies behind it. The monument is largely symbolic, and that raises immediate questions. Why invest so much effort into creating a facade that leads nowhere? What purpose did it serve? Researchers generally believe the monument held religious significance, perhaps connected to a goddess worshipped by the Phrygians. The facade may have functioned as a sacred focal point rather than a practical building. But certainty remains elusive. No detailed explanation survives. The people who carved it left the monument, not the instructions. And that pattern repeats throughout the valley. Everywhere you look, evidence appears of deliberate activity, whose full meaning has been lost. Rock-cut altars, mysterious niches, ancient stairways leading toward seemingly inaccessible locations, carved chambers whose purposes remain uncertain. The landscape feels less like an archaeological site and more like an enormous stone archive filled with partially erased pages. Some sections can still be read, others cannot. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Phrygian Valley is the way natural and human-made features merge together. Ancient builders did not simply construct monuments within the environment. They integrated them into it. Cliffs became shrines. Rock formations became temples. The landscape itself became architecture. This approach creates an unusual impression even today. You are never entirely certain where nature ends and human intention begins. A cliff face suddenly reveals geometric carvings. A seemingly ordinary rock formation contains a hidden chamber. Ancient roads emerge unexpectedly from the terrain before disappearing again into the countryside. The effect is subtle and strangely powerful. Archaeologists believe many of these locations played important religious roles. The Phrygians appear to have maintained strong connections to sacred landscapes, particularly places associated with mountains, rock formations, and natural features. This was not unusual in the ancient world. Many societies viewed distinctive landscapes as places where divine forces could be encountered. Yet, understanding the details of Phrygian belief remains difficult. Their written records are limited. Many inscriptions survive only in fragmentary form. As a result, scholars often find themselves interpreting physical remains without access to the stories that once explained them. The monuments survive. The mythology largely does not. That absence creates opportunities for speculation. And, over the years, the valley has attracted its share of unusual theories. Some visitors have suggested that certain structures served astronomical purposes. Others point to unusual carvings and geometric designs as evidence of hidden symbolic systems. A few even propose connections to lost knowledge or forgotten traditions stretching back into prehistory. Most archaeologists remain cautious. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, yet even conventional interpretations acknowledge that much remains unknown. The valley is simply too large, too complex, too layered. Every answer seems to generate additional questions. The ancient roads provide a good example. Researchers have identified extensive routes crossing portions of the landscape. Some appear clearly practical, linking settlements and important locations. Others are harder to explain. Certain paths traverse difficult terrain or connect sites whose relationships remain unclear. Were they pilgrimage routes, trade routes, ceremonial pathways? Different roads may have served different purposes, but once again, definitive answers remain out of reach. You can imagine traveling through the valley 27 centuries ago. The kingdom is thriving. Caravans move between settlements. Priests conduct ceremonies at sacred sites. Travelers pass monuments that are already famous throughout the region. Every cliff and valley carries meaning, understood by those who live there. The landscape speaks a language they recognize, a language that has largely disappeared. And perhaps that is what makes the Phrygian Valley so compelling. Unlike many archaeological sites focused on individual structures, this entire region appears shaped by beliefs and traditions that are only partially recoverable. The monuments are impressive, but they are fragments of a much larger system, a cultural worldview embedded within the land itself, one that modern observers can glimpse but rarely fully understand. The decline of the Phrygian kingdom did not erase the valley entirely. New cultures arrived. Empires expanded across Anatolia. The Persians, Greeks, Romans, and others left their own marks on the region. Yet traces of the older landscape endured. Some monuments remained visible. Some sacred places continued attracting attention. The memory of the Phrygians faded, but it never vanished completely. Today, visitors explore a landscape that still feels ancient in the deepest sense of the word. Wind moves across the valleys. The rock monuments remain where they have stood for millennia. The silence can be almost overwhelming, and everywhere questions linger. Questions carved into stone. As sunset spreads across the Anatolian highlands, long shadows stretch over the monumental facades. Ancient carvings glow briefly in the fading light before darkness begins to reclaim the valley. The kingdom is gone. Its rulers are gone. Its stories survive only in fragments. Yet the monuments remain, watching, waiting, guarding meanings that may never be fully recovered. And among those meanings, one question continues to echo across the Phrygian Valley. Were these extraordinary monuments merely expressions of royal power and religion, or are they surviving pieces of a much larger sacred landscape, whose true significance disappeared with the civilization that created it? High in the Ethiopian highlands, where mountains rise like ancient walls from the earth itself, a vast stone complex dominates the landscape. From a distance, it looks almost unreal. A fortress, a palace, a city enclosed within towering walls and massive gates, as if carved from the memory of some forgotten empire. This is Fasil Gebi, and it stands as one of the most remarkable architectural legacies in Africa. Yet despite its grandeur, its origins, its purpose, and even the full meaning of its design, continue to raise questions that historians are still trying to answer. The story begins in the 17th century, during a period of transformation in Ethiopian history. After centuries of shifting political centers, a new imperial capital was established here in the region of Gondar. At its heart stood Fasil Gebi, a royal enclosure unlike anything that had existed in the region before. Massive stone walls were constructed to define its boundaries. Within them rose palaces, churches, administrative buildings, and ceremonial spaces. The architecture blended influences from multiple traditions: Ethiopian, Arabian, Indian, and even European styles that had begun filtering into the region through trade and contact. The result was something unique, a hybrid landscape of power and symbolism. But what makes Fasil Gebi so intriguing is not only what it contains, but how it was built. Unlike many European castles of the same era, which were often developed over centuries of incremental expansion, Fasil Gebi appears to have emerged in a relatively short historical window under the reign of Emperor Fasilides. This sudden architectural flowering raises questions. Why here? Why then? And why such a dramatic concentration of monumental construction in this specific location? One explanation lies in geography. Gondar sits in a naturally defensible position within the Ethiopian highlands. The surrounding terrain offers elevation, visibility, and strategic control over nearby routes. For a medieval empire seeking stability, such a location provided clear advantages. But geography alone does not explain the scale of ambition. Fasil Gebi was not merely a fortress. It was a statement. Within its walls, emperors sought to express authority, divine legitimacy, and continuity with earlier traditions of Ethiopian kingship that stretched back centuries. Each structure within the enclosure served a purpose, whether administrative, ceremonial, or spiritual. Palaces were not just residences, they were symbols of imperial presence. Churches were not only places of worship, they were declarations of religious authority intertwined with political power. Yet even today, many details of its early construction remain unclear. Records from the period are incomplete. Some architectural phases are difficult to date precisely, and certain buildings appear to have undergone repeated modifications, whose reasons are not always fully understood. The result is a complex historical puzzle, a capital that evolved while simultaneously projecting the image of stability. One of the most iconic structures within the complex is the castle often attributed to Emperor Fasilides himself. Rising with distinctive towers and fortified walls, it reflects a blend of styles that has led some scholars to describe it as unlike any other royal building in Africa. Its design incorporates defensive features, ceremonial spaces, and symbolic architectural elements that suggest influences reaching far beyond Ethiopia's borders. Trade routes connecting the Red Sea, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian Ocean world brought ideas, materials, and craftsmen into the region. Fasil Gebi became a meeting point of cultures. But not all influences are fully traceable. Some architectural features appear locally derived, but do not match earlier Ethiopian styles in a straightforward way. Others seem inspired by external traditions, but adapted in unique ways that defy simple categorization. This blending creates both richness and ambiguity. Even the layout of the complex raises questions. The arrangement of palaces, churches, courtyards, and gates suggests careful planning, yet the logic behind certain spatial decisions remains debated. Some scholars see symbolic alignments. Others emphasize practical considerations such as defense, climate, and administrative organization. Both interpretations may be partially correct, but neither fully resolves the complexity of the design. Beyond the architecture, Fasil Gebi also functioned as a political and ceremonial center. Imperial coronations, religious festivals, and state functions were held within its walls. It was a place where power was performed as much as exercised. You can imagine entering the enclosure during its height. Guarded gates open into vast courtyards. Stone walls rise on all sides. The emperor appears surrounded by architecture designed to amplify authority. Every structure reinforces the idea of continuity and legitimacy. Yet this image of stability concealed underlying tensions. The Ethiopian Empire during this period was not static. It was shaped by shifting alliances, regional rivalries, religious debates, and external pressures. Fasil Gebi existed within this dynamic environment, reflecting both strength and vulnerability. And over time, the center of power began to shift. By the late 18th century, imperial authority gradually moved away from Gondar. Political fragmentation increased. Regional rulers gained influence. The once unified imperial court became more dispersed. Fasil Gebi, once the heart of empire, slowly lost its central role. Buildings were no longer maintained at the same level. Parts of the complex fell into decline. Yet it was never fully abandoned. Instead, it transformed, a site of memory rather than continuous political power. This transformation adds another layer of mystery. Why did the political center shift so decisively away from such a carefully constructed capital? The answers are complex. Internal political struggles, changing power structures, regional autonomy movements, economic and military pressures. But even with these explanations, the speed and nature of the transition remain subjects of scholarly discussion. Some aspects of the site's history are still being reconstructed. Archaeological research continues to uncover details about construction phases, building techniques, and material usage. Restoration efforts have revealed evidence of earlier structures beneath later modifications, suggesting that the complex may be even more layered than previously thought. Each discovery deepens the story and complicates it. Today, Fasil Gebi stands as part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its ruins preserved against the backdrop of the Ethiopian highlands. Visitors walk through courtyards where emperors once held court. Stone corridors echo with silence. Towers rise above the landscape like remnants of a forgotten era. Yet despite its preservation, the site does not feel fully explained. It feels partially understood, as though only fragments of its full meaning have survived. And perhaps that is what makes Fasil Gebi so compelling. It is not just a palace complex. It is a record of ambition, adaptation, and cultural synthesis embedded in stone, a place where history is visible, but never fully complete. As the sun sets over the highlands, shadows stretch across the ancient walls. The stone structures glow briefly in warm light before fading into darkness. The complex becomes quiet again, as it has been for centuries. The emperors are gone. The court is gone. The political center has moved on. yet the walls remain. And among them, one question continues to linger across the stone courtyards of Fasil Gebi. Was this imperial city simply a product of political necessity and architectural ambition, or does its unusual blend of influences and rapid rise conceal a deeper story about how power, identity, and belief were truly shaped in the Ethiopian highlands? Deep within the central North Island of New Zealand, in a landscape of dense forest, volcanic plateaus, and mist-covered hills, a formation of stone emerges from the earth in an unusual and unsettling pattern. At first glance, it looks deliberate: massive blocks, straight edges, sharp right angles, a stacked arrangement that resembles the remains of a carefully constructed wall. But this is not a place where such structures are expected. No known ancient civilization is recorded as having built large stone architecture in this exact region, using techniques that would produce formations like these. And that is where the mystery begins. This is the Kaimanawa Wall, and it has become one of the most debated natural formations in New Zealand's archaeological landscape. The site lies near the Kaimanawa Range, an area shaped by volcanic activity and long-term geological forces. The surrounding environment is dominated by rugged terrain, dense vegetation, and layered rock formations that have been exposed and reshaped over vast stretches of time. At first sight, the structure appears almost artificial. The blocks seem too regular, the alignment too precise, the angles too clean. It gives the impression of something constructed rather than naturally formed. And that impression has fueled decades of speculation. Some observers believe the formation may represent remnants of an ancient human-built structure, possibly belonging to a civilization that predates known Polynesian settlement of New Zealand. Others argue it is entirely natural, shaped by geological processes such as jointing, erosion, and fracturing within volcanic rock. Between these two interpretations lies the enduring tension that defines the site: nature, or construction, order, or coincidence. The formation first gained widespread attention in the 1970s, when hikers and explorers documented its unusual appearance. Photographs circulated, and soon the site became a focal point for alternative theories about New Zealand's ancient past. The idea that it might be a man-made structure predating known history captured public imagination quickly. If true, it would suggest a previously unknown chapter in the region's human occupation, a history not recorded in oral traditions or archaeological evidence. But mainstream archaeologists approach the site with caution. Natural explanations are often more consistent with regional geology, especially in volcanic environments like the central North Island. Basalt and other volcanic rocks frequently fracture along predictable planes. Over time, erosion can expose these fractures in ways that mimic artificial construction. This process is well documented in other parts of the world. Columns of basalt can form striking geometric patterns. Block-like shapes can emerge through natural jointing. Horizontal and vertical fractures can create the illusion of masonry. In many cases, what appears engineered is simply the result of geological time acting on specific rock types. The Kaimanawa Formation may be one such example. Yet the debate persists. One reason is the striking regularity of certain sections. Some blocks appear unusually uniform in shape. Some alignments seem almost architectural, and certain angles appear too deliberate to some observers, even if geology can theoretically account for them. This tension between perception and explanation lies at the heart of the mystery. Human cognition is naturally inclined to recognize patterns, faces in clouds, shapes in landscapes, structures in random formations. This tendency can make natural features appear artificially constructed, even when no human activity was involved. But dismissing the site entirely as illusion does not fully resolve the questions either, because even if the formation is natural, it raises another issue. Why does it resemble architecture so closely? Why does it evoke the impression of design so strongly? The geological explanation centers on volcanic processes. The region's rock formations are the result of ancient eruptions, lava flows, and cooling events that occurred millions of years ago. As volcanic rock cools, it contracts and fractures. These fractures often form regular patterns known as jointing systems. Over time, erosion exposes these joints, creating block-like structures that can resemble stacked masonry. In certain conditions, this effect becomes especially pronounced: straight edges, flat surfaces, right angles. When viewed without geological context, such formations can appear unmistakably artificial. But the key question is whether the Kaimanawa Wall fits this pattern completely, or whether it contains anomalies that resist explanation. Some researchers argue that all observed features can be accounted for through natural processes. Others suggest that at least certain aspects deserve further investigation. The debate remains unresolved, and perhaps it always will remain so. Part of the fascination comes from the site's cultural context. New Zealand's history is deeply tied to Polynesian migration and settlement, particularly the arrival of the Maori people, whose navigation across the Pacific remains one of the great achievements of human exploration. Archaeological evidence strongly supports the timeline of settlement within the last 1,000 years. There is no confirmed evidence of earlier, large-scale architectural traditions in the region, comparable to the stone structures seen elsewhere in the world. This makes the idea of an ancient constructed wall difficult to reconcile with the established record. And yet, the formation persists. Visible, physical, unexplained to some, or fully explained to others. This duality is what keeps the Kaimanawa Wall in public discussion. It sits at the intersection of geology and imagination, science and speculation, observation and interpretation. Walking through the surrounding forest today, the site feels almost hidden. Vegetation partially obscures the stone formation. Moss and lichen cover portions of the rock. The structure does not dominate the landscape so much as blend into it, revealing itself only when approached closely. This subtlety adds to the uncertainty. It is not a monument that announces itself clearly. It must be examined carefully. And even then, interpretation depends heavily on perspective. Archaeologists emphasize measurable evidence. Geologists focus on formation processes. Alternative researchers highlight visual patterns. Each perspective sees something different in the same stone. The question is not simply what the wall is, but how it is being seen. Over time, the Kaimanawa Wall has become more than a geological curiosity. It has become a symbol of broader debates about human history, interpretation, and the limits of certainty in archaeology. How do we distinguish between natural formation and human construction when both can produce similar results under certain conditions? How do we avoid imposing meaning where none exists? And how do we remain open to possibilities without abandoning scientific rigor? These questions extend far beyond a single site. They reflect the challenges of interpreting the deep past itself. Today, the formation remains largely protected within its natural environment. Researchers continue to study it, but no definitive consensus has emerged. It stands as both a physical structure and a conceptual puzzle, a reminder that landscapes can deceive, or appear to deceive, and that certainty is often more fragile than it seems. As mist moves through the forest and light filters across the stone surface, the Kaimanawa wall appears once again as it always does, part pattern, part mystery, part question without a final answer. And in that ambiguity, one final question continues to echo through the quiet forest. Is the Kaimanawa wall simply the product of ancient geological forces shaping volcanic rock? Or does it reveal how easily the boundary between nature and human design can blur when time stretches beyond comprehension? On the outskirts of Nanjing, China, where modern highways cut across hills once shaped only by wind and time, a vast stone scar lies exposed on the landscape. It is not a ruin in the traditional sense. There are no temples, no palaces, no inscriptions carved by emperors into finished monuments. Instead, there is only stone, massive, half-separated, still attached to the bedrock, a monument not completed, but abandoned mid-creation. This is the Yangshan Quarry, and it holds one of the most staggering unfinished projects in ancient history. The site lies within a limestone hill that was once selected to supply stone for imperial construction during the Ming Dynasty. Under the rule of the Yongle Emperor, a period defined by enormous architectural ambition, the imperial court sought materials for a monument that would symbolize the authority of the dynasty itself. That monument would become the Ming Xiaoling Mausoleum Complex in Nanjing, one of the most important imperial burial sites in China. But before any structure could rise, stone had to be extracted, and Yangshan was chosen for the task. What followed was an engineering undertaking of extraordinary scale. The quarry was carved directly into the hillside, where workers began separating enormous stone blocks from solid bedrock. These were not small architectural pieces. They were massive components intended for ceremonial structures, stone steles and architectural elements that required precision on a monumental scale. Some blocks were so large that they defy easy categorization. They are not simply stones. They are architectural fragments of a plan never completed. 3 of the most famous unfinished pieces remain partially attached to the mountain itself. One is a colossal stele base. Another is a massive column-like structure. A third lies in a horizontal position, still fused to the rock beneath it. Each one appears as though it was almost complete, and then abandoned. The marks of human labor are still visible across their surfaces: chisel grooves, cutting lines, carefully planned extraction points. The intention is unmistakable. These were not random carvings. They were deliberate architectural components in progress. The question is why they were never finished. To understand that mystery, it is necessary to consider the scale of imperial ambition during the early Ming Dynasty. The Yongle Emperor was one of the most powerful rulers of his era. His reign was marked by enormous construction projects, including the expansion of the Forbidden City and the commissioning of vast ceremonial complexes intended to reinforce imperial legitimacy. Stone was central to this vision. In Chinese imperial architecture, stone monuments were not merely structural. They were symbolic expressions of permanence, authority, and connection between heaven and earth. The Ming Xiaoling Mausoleum was designed to embody these principles. It required precision-cut stone on an unprecedented scale, and Yangshan was selected to provide it. Workers at the quarry faced immense challenges. Limestone had to be carefully cut to avoid fractures. Massive blocks had to be isolated from surrounding rock using traditional tools and techniques that demanded extraordinary patience and skill. Wooden wedges, metal chisels, and controlled extraction methods were used to gradually separate stone from the hillside. The process was slow, labor-intensive, and extremely risky. One mistake could ruin an entire block. Yet despite these difficulties, progress was made, until suddenly it stopped. The unfinished stone blocks at Yangshan appear frozen in time. The largest steely base alone weighs hundreds of tons in its incomplete state. It was intended to be even larger, one of the most monumental carved stones in imperial China, but it was never detached from the bedrock. It remains where workers left it. This abrupt halt has led historians to investigate possible explanations. One widely accepted theory suggests that the quarrying process was halted due to structural instability. As workers progressed, cracks may have appeared in the stone, making full extraction impossible without risking collapse. Limestone, while workable, can be unpredictable under stress. If a fracture develops during cutting, the entire block can become unusable. Another possibility is that the imperial design itself changed during construction. Large projects in imperial China were often subject to revision. New architectural decisions could render previous quarrying efforts obsolete. A third explanation involves logistics and resource allocation. The scale of imperial construction required enormous labor forces and materials. It is possible that priorities shifted, and resources were redirected to other projects within the empire. Each explanation is plausible. None is definitively proven. What remains certain is that work stopped before completion and never resumed. The result is one of the most visually striking archaeological landscapes in China. Unlike finished monuments, Yangshan reveals process rather than outcome. It exposes the methods of ancient stone extraction in a way that is rarely visible elsewhere. The quarry is essentially a frozen workshop, preserving the moment when ambition exceeded completion. You can still see how the workers approached the stone. Vertical cuts marking planned separations, horizontal grooves indicating where blocks were meant to detach, the careful planning behind each monumental piece. It is a sight that reveals intention more clearly than achievement, and that is what makes it so compelling. Most ancient monuments show what civilizations accomplished. Yangshan shows what they attempted. Walking through the quarry today, the scale becomes difficult to comprehend. The unfinished stele base rises like a wall of stone, still connected to the mountain. Its surface bears the marks of tools wielded centuries ago. The edges suggest the shape it was meant to become, but that shape was never realized. The silence of the site adds to its impact. There are no reconstructed buildings, no modern reinterpretations, only raw stone and the traces of ancient labor. Yet despite its clarity, questions remain. Why were these specific stones chosen? How far did construction progress before abandonment? Were there technical failures, political decisions, or environmental factors that forced the cessation of work? Historical records from the Ming period provide some context, but they do not fully explain the abrupt halt visible in the quarry itself. This gap between record and reality is where interpretation becomes difficult. The imperial bureaucracy was extensive, but not every decision was recorded in detail. Even major construction projects can leave behind incomplete documentation, especially when plans change rapidly or priorities shift within the court. Archaeology fills some gaps, but not all. The stones themselves become the most reliable witnesses. They preserve evidence of human intention more clearly than written texts, and yet they remain silent about the reasons behind abandonment. That silence is what gives Yangshan its haunting quality. It is not a ruin created by time. It is a project interrupted by circumstance, a moment of industrial history paused indefinitely. Today, the quarry stands as both a historical site and a reminder of the limits of ambition. It demonstrates the extraordinary capabilities of imperial engineering, while also revealing how even the most powerful systems can leave projects unfinished. As sunlight moves across the hillside, shadows emphasize the contours of the incomplete stones. The unfinished steely base casts a massive silhouette across the ground. The quarry feels suspended between construction and memory, a place where effort still lingers in physical form. And as visitors stand before these colossal fragments, one question inevitably arises. What force was powerful enough to halt one of the most ambitious stone projects of the Ming Dynasty mid-process? And why does Yangshan remain forever frozen at the exact moment when intention gave way to interruption? In the northwestern deserts of Saudi Arabia, where sandstone cliffs rise like eroded fortresses and the wind reshapes the land grain by grain, traces of an ancient civilization emerge from the silence. At first, they are almost invisible. A carved step in the rock, a faint inscription, a shadowed doorway cut into stone. Then, gradually, the scale reveals itself. Entire necropolises, monumental tombs, carved facades standing alone in vast desert emptiness. This is the territory of the ancient Dadonite and Lyhianite civilizations, centered around what is now known as the Oasis region of Alula. And among their most striking remains are the ruins of the Dadan Kingdom, a city that once stood at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Arabia, the Levant, and beyond. Today, only fragments remain. But those fragments suggest a civilization far more complex than its desert surroundings might imply. The ancient settlement of Dadan occupied a fertile oasis, sustained by underground water sources and seasonal rainfall. In a region defined by arid conditions, such oases became essential hubs of life, commerce, and power. Caravans traveling across the Arabian Peninsula depended on such stops, and Dadan became one of the most important. Historical sources from neighboring civilizations refer to a wealthy and influential kingdom in this region. Assyrian inscriptions mention interactions with Arabian groups. Later references in classical texts hint at a network of trade and cultural exchange stretching across deserts and seas. But much of Dadan's own written record remains fragmentary. Inscriptions carved into stone survive, yet many are still being deciphered. The ruins themselves speak more clearly than the texts. At the heart of the site are monumental tombs carved directly into cliff faces. These are not simple burial chambers. They are architectural statements designed to be seen from a distance. Some facades are simple. Others are highly elaborate. Rectangular doorways are framed by decorative elements carved into solid rock. Some tombs are marked with symbols whose meanings remain uncertain. Others are completely unadorned, yet still imposing in scale. Each tomb represents a deliberate act of permanence, a declaration that the individuals buried within were meant to endure beyond death. But who exactly they were is not always clear. Unlike later Islamic burial traditions in the region, these tombs reflect pre-Islamic cultural practices that emphasized monumental commemoration. They suggest a society with hierarchical structures, where elite individuals possessed the resources to commission large-scale funerary architecture. The labor required to carve these tombs was immense. Workers had to cut directly into vertical sandstone cliffs, shaping entire chambers and facades using hand tools. The precision required indicates advanced knowledge of stonework and careful planning, Yet the process remains partially understood. No detailed construction manuals survive. No complete explanations accompany the architecture. Only the finished forms remain, and even those raise questions. Some tombs appear unfinished, their facades abruptly stopping mid-design. Others show variations in style that suggest different phases of construction or possibly different cultural influences over time. This diversity points to a long and evolving tradition, rather than a single architectural moment. The Dadonite kingdom was not static. It changed, adapted, interacted with surrounding cultures. Its position along trade routes meant constant exposure to external influences. Goods, people, and ideas passed through the region, shaping its development over centuries. Incense trade, in particular, played a significant role in the prosperity of the region. Aromatic resins from southern Arabia were highly valued in the ancient world, used in religious rituals, ceremonies, and elite households across distant civilizations. Dadan sat along these trade corridors. Controlling access meant controlling wealth, and wealth is visible in stone. The scale of the tombs reflects this economic power. But the question remains, why were these monumental structures carved in such isolated, exposed locations, rather than within a protected urban center? One possibility is that visibility itself was the goal. These tombs were meant to be seen, not hidden, not protected, displayed across the landscape like permanent markers of status and identity. In that sense, the desert becomes a gallery, a vast open-air archive of memory and power. Yet the city that supported this culture remains only partially uncovered. Archaeological excavations have revealed walls, domestic structures, and administrative remains. But much of the settlement likely still lies beneath shifting sands, or remains unexcavated due to the scale of the terrain. What has been found suggests a complex urban environment. Residential areas, workshops, religious structures, and infrastructure supporting long-distance trade. Still, the full layout of the ancient city is not known. This incomplete picture leaves significant gaps in understanding how the society functioned as a whole. One of the most intriguing aspects of the site is the presence of inscriptions written in ancient North Arabian scripts. These texts provide glimpses into names, dedications, and possibly legal or religious practices. But interpretation is difficult. Many inscriptions are weathered. Some are incomplete. Others remain undeciphered. As a result, historians rely heavily on comparison with better understood languages and external sources. This creates a fragile reconstruction of meaning, one built from fragments, not certainty. Beyond the tombs and inscriptions, the landscape itself plays an important role in shaping the mystery of Dadan. The surrounding cliffs are naturally dramatic, with sharp ridges and layered sandstone formations that shift color with the light. Ancient builders worked directly with this environment. They did not separate architecture from landscape. They merged them. A tomb is not placed on the rock. It is carved into it. The result is a civilization that appears inseparable from its geology. Yet despite this strong physical presence, the cultural memory of Dadan faded over time. Later, civilizations in the region, including the Nabateans and others, eventually rose to prominence. Trade routes shifted. Political structures changed. New centers of power emerged. Dadan gradually receded into obscurity. Its monuments remained, but its story became fragmented. Today, modern archaeology is slowly reconstructing that story. Each excavation adds new pieces. Each inscription adds new possibilities. Yet the overall narrative remains incomplete. There are still unanswered questions about the kingdom's political structure, religious beliefs, and eventual decline. No single catastrophic event explains its disappearance. Instead, it appears to have faded gradually, absorbed into broader regional transformations. That gradual disappearance makes the surviving monuments even more powerful. They are not ruins of destruction. They are remnants of continuity interrupted by time. Standing in the desert today, the silence is overwhelming. The carved tombs rise from the cliffs like frozen memories. The wind moves across the valley, carrying dust through empty spaces that once held human activity, commerce, and ritual life. It is difficult to reconcile the scale of what remains with the scarcity of what is known. And that tension defines Dadan, a civilization visible in stone, but partially invisible in understanding. As the sun sets over the sandstone cliffs, shadows deepen across the carved facades. The tombs appear to watch the desert as they have for centuries, their meanings preserved in form, but not fully in interpretation. The people who built them are gone. Their language survives only in fragments. Their intentions are partially lost. And among these silent cliffs, one question continues to linger across the ruins of the Dadan kingdom. Was this desert city ever fully understood by the civilizations that followed it? Or does it still conceal a deeper narrative of power, trade, and belief that has yet to be recovered from the sands of Arabia? In the remote mountains of the Sinai Peninsula, where jagged peaks rise from barren valleys and silence stretches across stone like an unbroken spell, an ancient site clings to the rock. It is not a city, not a fortress, not a temple in the conventional sense. It is something more fragmented, more cryptic, a place where human presence is recorded not in grand architecture, but in inscriptions, carvings, and ritual spaces scattered across the cliffs. This is Khirbet el-Khadim, and it is one of the earliest known sites where writing itself begins to take shape. Long before alphabets spread across the ancient world, before Phoenician scripts influenced Greek and Latin traditions, workers and travelers in this harsh landscape carved symbols into stone that may represent one of the earliest steps toward alphabetic writing. But Khirbet el-Khadim is not defined by writing alone. It is defined by contradiction, a remote desert landscape, yet a center of industrial activity, a place of hardship, yet also of devotion. For thousands of years, this mountain region was valued for its mineral wealth, particularly turquoise. Ancient Egyptians considered turquoise a precious material, associated with beauty, protection, and divine favor. It was used in jewelry, ceremonial objects, and royal decoration. To extract it, expeditions were sent deep into Sinai, and Khirbet el-Khadim became one of the primary mining and religious centers supporting that effort. At the heart of the site stands a temple dedicated to the goddess Hathor, often associated with mining, fertility, and foreign lands. The temple itself is carved and built into the landscape, blending constructed spaces with natural rock formations. It was not merely a place of worship, it was part of a working system. Miners, officials, soldiers, and priests all moved through this isolated environment, maintaining a fragile balance between extraction and ritual. Life here was harsh. Water was scarce. Temperatures extreme. The terrain unforgiving. Yet expeditions continued for centuries, because the turquoise beneath these mountains was worth the effort. The Temple of Hathor became the spiritual center of these mining operations. Workers sought divine protection before descending into dangerous shafts. Ritual offerings were made to ensure safety and success. The boundary between labor and religion was blurred. In this environment, something extraordinary emerged. Inscriptions carved by Semitic-speaking workers appear alongside traditional Egyptian hieroglyphs. These inscriptions do not fully match the formal writing systems of Egypt. Instead, they appear simpler, more flexible, and potentially more phonetic in nature. Some scholars believe these markings represent an early stage in the development of alphabetic writing. If true, Khirbet el-Khadim would not only be a mining site or a temple complex, it would be one of the birthplaces of the alphabet itself. But this interpretation remains debated. The inscriptions are fragmentary, their meanings are uncertain, and their relationship to later writing systems is not fully understood. Still, the possibility is extraordinary. At the time these inscriptions were created, Egyptian hieroglyphs were already a highly developed writing system. They combined logographic and phonetic elements in a complex structure used for administration, religion, and monumental inscriptions. But hieroglyphs were also complex and highly specialized. They required extensive training. They were controlled by scribal elites. In contrast, the inscriptions at Khirbet el-Khadim appear more accessible, suggesting a different kind of communication system emerging within a multicultural workforce. Workers from different linguistic backgrounds needed ways to communicate. And, in the process, they may have simplified symbols into more direct representations of sound. This theory, known as the Proto-Sinaitic hypothesis, proposes that these inscriptions represent an early alphabetic system that would later influence Phoenician writing and eventually many modern alphabets. If accurate, the implications are profound. It would mean that some of the most fundamental tools of human communication originated not in royal courts or major cities, but in a remote mining operation in the desert. However, certainty remains elusive. The inscriptions are few in number. Their interpretation is not universally agreed upon, and alternative explanations suggest they may represent localized adaptations of Egyptian writing rather than a fully independent alphabetic system. Archaeology often operates in this space of partial clarity. Evidence suggests possibilities, but does not always confirm them. Beyond the inscriptions, the Temple of Hathor itself adds another layer of complexity. It was expanded over time by different rulers, including pharaohs who sent expeditions into Sinai to secure resources. Stelae and carved reliefs commemorate these journeys, recording the names of officials and the success of mining operations. These inscriptions help anchor the site within known historical frameworks. They confirm Egyptian presence and administrative control, but they do not fully explain the lives of the workers who lived and labored here. Those individuals remain largely invisible in the official records, except for the faint traces they left behind in stone. You can imagine the scene centuries ago. Expeditions arriving after long journeys across desert terrain. Workers descending into mine shafts carved into rock. Priests conducting rituals at the temple entrance. Officials recording yields of turquoise and copper. The sound of tools striking stone echoes through narrow valleys. And above it all, the Temple of Hathor stands as a symbolic center, linking human effort with a divine oversight. Yet even in such a structured environment, cultural exchange was inevitable. Different groups interacted daily, languages mixed, writing systems overlapped. And in that intersection, innovation may have occurred. The inscriptions that concern modern scholars are often simple in appearance. They consist of linear shapes, sometimes resembling later alphabetic letters. Unlike formal hieroglyphs, they do not always follow strict artistic conventions. This simplicity is what makes them so significant, because it suggests adaptation, a shift toward efficiency, a way of recording sound rather than complex symbolic meaning. Still, interpreting these markings requires caution. It is easy to see connections where none exist. It is also possible to overlook genuine developments because they do not fit expected narratives. Khirbet el-Khadim sits precisely at this intersection of possibility and uncertainty, a place where writing may have been transformed, but where evidence remains incomplete. Over time, the mining operations declined. Egyptian control over Sinai fluctuated. New sources of turquoise became available elsewhere, and the remote temple complex gradually lost its central importance. The mines were abandoned. The workers departed. The desert began reclaiming the site. Stone structures remained, but human activity faded. Today, the ruins are scattered across a stark and silent landscape. The Temple of Hathor still stands in partial form, its walls bearing inscriptions from multiple periods. Mining tunnels disappear into darkness beneath the mountains, and high on the cliffs, faint inscriptions remain carved into stone, some clearly Egyptian, some clearly Semitic, some still undeciphered. Each one a fragment of communication from a world that existed thousands of years ago. Together, they form one of the most intriguing linguistic puzzles in archaeology, because Khirbet el-Khadim is not just about mining, it is about meaning, about how humans begin to turn sound into symbol, and symbol into writing. As the sun sets over the Sinai Mountains, shadows stretch across the temple ruins. The wind moves through abandoned corridors. The cliffs glow briefly in fading light before returning to darkness. The inscriptions remain, silent, unfinished in their interpretation, and among them, one question continues to echo across the ancient desert. Did the workers of Khirbet el-Khadim witness the earliest formation of alphabetic writing? Or are these carvings simply echoes of a more complex system of communication that has only partially survived the passage of time? In the heart of the Mesopotamian steppe, where the desert stretches outward in endless waves of sand and stone, an ancient city rises from the horizon like a mirage that refuses to disappear. Its walls are still standing, its temples still intact, its presence still overwhelming even after nearly 2,000 years of abandonment. This is Hatra, and it is one of the most extraordinary surviving cities of the ancient Near East. Unlike many archaeological sites reduced to scattered foundations, Hatra remains visibly defined. Massive defensive walls encircle the ruins. Tower-like structures rise at intervals. Within, the outlines of temples, courtyards, and sanctuaries still shape the ancient urban plan. It is a city that appears suspended between ruin and preservation. And yet, despite its physical clarity, its cultural identity remains complex. Hatra existed at a crossroads of civilizations, between empires, between languages, between religions. Located in northern Mesopotamia, it developed during a period when powerful states such as the Parthian Empire dominated the region. While not fully integrated into any single imperial structure, Hatra maintained a degree of autonomy, benefiting from its position along important trade and military routes. Caravans passed through. Merchants arrived from distant lands. Ideas moved alongside goods. This constant flow of interaction shaped the city into something unique, a hybrid cultural space where architectural styles, religious traditions, and artistic influences merged. The most striking feature of Hatra is its monumental architecture. Temples dominate the central district, built with massive stone blocks and decorated with intricate carvings. columns rise in rhythmic sequences. Arched entrances frame sacred spaces. Sculptural reliefs depict deities whose identities reflect a blend of Mesopotamian, Arab, Iranian, and Greco-Roman influences. This fusion is not accidental. It reflects the city's role as a cultural meeting point. But it also raises questions. How did such a diverse religious system function in practice? Were these traditions fully integrated, or did they coexist in parallel within shared sacred spaces? The archaeological evidence suggests both unity and diversity. Different deities appear within the same architectural complexes, yet stylistic differences remain visible in their representation. The result is a religious landscape that feels both cohesive and fragmented. One of the most important structures within Hatra is the Great Temple Complex, often associated with a central deity known in local tradition as Shamash, or a solar god figure. This sanctuary dominates the city's interior, suggesting a centralizing religious function. But surrounding it are smaller temples dedicated to other divine figures. This spatial arrangement hints at a layered religious system, not a single unified pantheon, but a network of overlapping traditions. Understanding how worship functioned in such an environment remains a challenge. Ritual practices are only partially recorded. Inscriptions provide names and dedications, but rarely detailed descriptions of ceremonies. Much of what is known comes from architectural interpretation rather than written explanation. And architecture, while informative, does not speak directly. The city's defensive system is equally impressive. Massive stone walls stretch for kilometers, punctuated by fortified towers. These defenses were not merely symbolic. Hatra withstood multiple military campaigns, including assaults by powerful external empires. Historical sources describe attempts by Roman forces to capture the city during their eastern campaigns. According to accounts, those attempts failed. Hatra resisted siege. It endured pressure that would have overwhelmed many other settlements of its size. This resilience contributed to its reputation in antiquity as a fortified stronghold of exceptional strength. Yet even the strongest cities eventually face decline. Hatra's downfall came in the early 3rd century CE, when it was targeted by the expanding Sasanian Empire under Ardashir I. Unlike previous attackers, the Sasanians succeeded in breaching its defenses. The city fell, its political autonomy ended, and its population dispersed. What remains today is the skeleton of that once powerful urban center. But even in ruin, Hatra retains an unusual coherence. Unlike sites gradually dismantled over centuries, Hatra appears to have been abandoned in a relatively abrupt historical moment. Buildings remain largely in place. Streets are still traceable. Temple structures are intact enough to reveal their original layout. This preservation creates an unusual effect. It feels less like a ruin, and more like a paused city. One frozen at the moment of transition between life and abandonment. Archaeologists studying Hatra have been able to reconstruct significant aspects of its urban organization. Residential areas surround the central religious zone. Markets likely operated along main thoroughfares. Administrative functions were distributed within the fortified core, yet many details remain uncertain. How exactly governance functioned within the city is still debated. Whether authority was centralized or distributed among elite groups is not fully clear. Inscriptions offer partial clues, but not enough to build a complete picture. Religious artifacts and sculptures add further complexity. Deities are depicted with varying attributes depending on context and artistic style. Some figures appear distinctly Mesopotamian, others show Parthian or Arabian influence. Still others incorporate elements from Hellenistic traditions. This blending reflects not confusion, but interaction. Hatra was not isolated. It was deeply embedded within the cultural currents of its time. Yet its identity remains difficult to categorize. Was it primarily Mesopotamian, Parthian, Arab, Aramaic, or something entirely distinct? Modern classifications struggle to contain its complexity. Even the language of its inscriptions reflects this mixture. Aramaic served as a common written medium, but local variations and names suggest a multilingual environment. The city speaks in multiple voices, and none of them fully dominate. Walking through the ruins today, the scale of the city becomes apparent. Massive arches still frame empty spaces. Columns rise against the desert sky. Stone carvings remain etched into weathered surfaces. Wind moves through structures that once held dense urban life. The silence is profound, yet not empty. It feels charged with historical presence. One of the most intriguing aspects of Hatra is how it challenges expectations about frontier cities. It was not a marginal settlement. It was not a simple military outpost. It was a thriving urban center capable of resisting imperial armies and sustaining a complex cultural identity. This raises questions about how power functioned in border regions of ancient empires. Control was not always direct. Influence could be negotiated. Autonomy could exist within larger geopolitical systems. Hatra embodies this dynamic. A city both connected and independent, subordinate and sovereign. In many ways, its history reflects the instability of the region itself, where shifting imperial boundaries created spaces of cultural hybridity and political ambiguity. Today, UNESCO recognizes Hatra as a World Heritage Site, acknowledging both its architectural significance and its cultural importance. Yet the site has also suffered damage in recent years due to conflict and instability in the region. This adds a modern layer to its long history of survival and destruction, a reminder that ancient cities remain vulnerable even in the present. As the sun sets over the Mesopotamian desert, the stone walls of Hatra glow in fading light. Shadows stretch across temples that once housed elaborate rituals. The wind passes through arches that once framed processions of worshippers and rulers. The city stands empty, but not silent in meaning. And, as night approaches, one question continues to linger across the ruins of Hatra. Was this city truly a singular cultural identity shaped by its frontier position, or does it represent something even more complex? A place where multiple civilizations did not merely meet, but merged into a form of urban life that defies simple classification. On the rugged slopes of ancient Lycia, where steep mountains descend sharply toward the Mediterranean coast, a carved stone monument stands suspended in time. It is not large, not sprawling, but it is intensely detailed, almost unnervingly so. A square tomb chamber rises on a high stone pillar, its sides covered in reliefs that have puzzled observers for centuries. Figures appear to emerge from the stone itself, half human, half mythic, arranged in scenes whose meaning is still debated. This is the Harpy Tomb, and its reliefs remain among the most enigmatic artworks of the ancient Mediterranean world. Located in what is now southwestern Turkey, within the region once known as Lycia, the tomb dates back to around the 5th century BCE, a period when Lycian culture existed at the intersection of Greek, Persian, and indigenous Anatolian influences. It is a world of cultural overlap and artistic fusion. The tomb itself is believed to have been built for a Lycian ruler, possibly a dynast named Khibernus. But while its architectural form follows local funerary traditions, elevated burial chambers designed to protect and honor the dead, it is the carved imagery that draws the most attention. On each side of the tomb, relief panels depict scenes of enigmatic figures interacting with seated human forms. The most famous of these figures are the so-called harpies, winged beings, human above, bird-like below. They appear to carry small figures or offerings, lifting them from one realm to another. Their motion is frozen in stone, yet their meaning remains fluid. The term harpy itself comes from later Greek mythology, where such beings were associated with wind spirits who carried souls away. But whether the Lycian carvings were intended to represent the same concept is uncertain. What we see may not be what the original culture intended to express. That uncertainty is central to the mystery. The reliefs show seated figures, likely representations of the deceased or divine authorities, interacting with attendants and the winged beings. The composition suggests a narrative, but the story cannot be fully reconstructed. There is motion, but no translation, presence, but no explanation. Lycia itself was a region shaped by constant cultural interaction. Though geographically part of Anatolia, it was deeply influenced by Greek art and language, especially during the period of Persian dominance in the region. Local traditions blended with external influences, producing a distinctive artistic style. The Harpy Tomb reflects this blend. Its architecture follows Lycian funerary customs, particularly the tradition of elevated stone tombs designed to resemble wooden structures. Yet, its sculptural style shows strong Greek influence in anatomical detail, drapery, and composition. This fusion creates ambiguity. Is the tomb primarily Lycian, or is it a hybrid product of cross-cultural exchange? The answer is likely both, but that duality complicates interpretation, because cultural hybridity often produces symbols that do not translate easily into modern categories. One of the most debated aspects of the reliefs is the role of the winged figures themselves. Some scholars interpret them as psychopomps, beings that guide souls to the afterlife. In this reading, the tomb becomes a visual representation of transition between life and death. Others suggest a more political interpretation. The seated figures may represent rulers receiving offerings or tribute, while the winged beings symbolize divine sanction or cosmic authority. Still others argue for a purely symbolic or mythological reading, in which the scenes represent local belief systems that were later reinterpreted through Greek mythological frameworks. None of these interpretations fully resolves the imagery. Each explains part of the evidence, but leaves gaps. The reliefs are also remarkable for their sense of vertical movement. The composition appears to connect multiple levels of existence: earth, sky, and possibly the divine realm above. The tomb itself, elevated on a pillar, reinforces this vertical symbolism. It is as if the entire structure is designed to communicate transition, movement upward, away from the human world, toward something beyond. This raises an important question. Was the tomb intended primarily as a burial monument, or as a visual statement about the journey of the soul? In Lycian culture, tombs were not hidden or sealed away. They were often placed in visible, elevated positions, sometimes carved into cliff faces or placed on stone platforms. The dead were not removed from society and memory. They remained part of the landscape. The Harpy Tomb fits this tradition, yet it also exceeds it in complexity. The presence of narrative reliefs suggests an attempt to communicate something beyond simple commemoration. It suggests a worldview in which death, authority, and divine forces were interconnected in ways that are no longer fully understood. Over time, the monument suffered damage. One of the original relief panels was removed in the 19th century and taken to the British Museum, where it remains today. This displacement adds another layer to the tomb's fragmented story. The monument is no longer whole. Its meaning is partially dispersed across space, and interpretation becomes even more difficult when the object itself is incomplete. Modern visitors to the site encounter a reconstruction of the tomb with replicas replacing missing elements. Even so, the sense of mystery remains strong. The figures carved into the stone still appear to move between worlds, still suspended, still unresolved. Archaeologists studying the Harpy Tomb must rely on a combination of stylistic analysis, comparative mythology, and fragmentary historical records. There are no inscriptions explaining the scenes, no written guide to their meaning, only the stone itself, and what it chooses to show. This absence of textual explanation is crucial. In many ancient cultures, images were not secondary to writing. They were independent systems of meaning. Visual storytelling could operate without direct translation into language, but without cultural context, those systems become opaque. Modern interpretation risks projecting later myths onto earlier imagery, and the Harpy Tomb exists precisely in that zone of uncertainty. It is ancient enough to predate clear explanatory traditions, yet complex enough to resist simple classification. Standing before it today, one is struck not only by the artistry, but by the silence surrounding it. The carved figures appear to interact, to gesture, to carry meaning. Yet the message they convey remains just out of reach. Wind moves across the Lycian mountains. Light shifts across the stone surface, and the reliefs seem to change with it, as though their meaning is not fixed, but dependent on perspective, as if the story is still unfolding, but never fully revealed. And among the carved wings and seated figures, one question continues to linger across the ancient stone of the Harpy Tomb. Were these reliefs intended as a literal depiction of the journey of the soul, or do they preserve a now-lost narrative system whose meaning can no longer be translated into any known language of myth or history?